Peter Baelish stood at the highest balcony of the Red Keep, gazing out across the sprawl of King's Landing. From that lofty vantage, the city looked almost peaceful in the early evening light. Lanterns glowed in the windows of tall, teetering tenements. Small torches began to sparkle like low stars along the winding streets. The faint roar of the city drifted upward, a murmuring tide of voices, hooves, and wagon wheels striking cobblestone. He found it pleasant, hypnotic, even how easily the throng moved without any direct orchestration. The people lived their lives with minimal awareness of who ruled them, of who pulled the strings behind the scenes. Yet, in a corner of his mind, Peter mused, if I decreed that trade ships not enter Blackwater Bay for a fortnight, half the city would starve. If I commanded the gold cloaks to seal the gates, if I whispered a single rumor into the right ears, I could empty these streets in a matter of days. Though they had no notion of it, these thousands were all subject to his will. Or they would be soon enough. He listened to the wind. There, he almost thought he could detect faint notes of the sea beyond the city. Or perhaps he simply knew it was there and conjured the sound from memory. A sly smile curved across his lips. Protector of the realm. The words still tasted like honey on his tongue. It was an honorific meant for a regent, for a caretaker of the crown until a rightful king was of age. But the 7 kingdoms had become so tangled in war, so devoured by the scorpion's nest of alliances and betrayals, that the matter of rightful inheritance was no longer clear. Peter had seized that uncertainty, fashioned it into a cloak of legitimacy, and now wore it with unapologetic flair. He'd engineered the downfall of those who might have claimed the throne or influenced it, some by betrayal, some by rumor, some by a well-placed dagger. Others had undone themselves simply by trusting him, a mistake he encouraged and humored with an unctuous courtesy that never seemed to waver. And so one day, with the crown vacant and no undisputed heir left to fight for it, the small council and key lords, many in Peter's pocket, had chosen him, Peter Baelish, to be protector. Not king, but a caretaker of the throne, a final arbiter of disputes, a guardian of law and order, or so the illusions were spun. It helped that he had carefully orchestrated the crippling of any alternative. The real power, thus, was his. He turned from the balcony. A single guard awaited him at the threshold, bowing stiffly. The man was newly placed, the old rotation of gold cloaks replaced by Peter's new appointments. The best swords, or the most desperate and easily bought, were kept close. Littlefinger didn't trust the truly honorable men, for they could not be bent as needed. Manipulation followed the line of a man's desires, and honorable men often desired intangible things, integrity, duty, or worthless illusions that couldn't be twisted with gold. But desperate or ambitious men, those were excellent clay. They might want coin or titles or forgiveness for old crimes, or illusions of status for wives or children. All Peter could provide. All Peter would exploit. He glided along the corridors of the Red Keep, boots tapping lightly on the stone floor. The flicker of torches made the walls seem alive with dancing shadows. He greeted a few passing guards with that same carefully measured smile. They nodded or saluted, none entirely comfortable in his presence. It was wise for them to fear him, even if they didn't fully know why. He entered the great hall. Moonlight drifted through high windows, shining upon the empty iron throne like a half-faded memory of ages past. Peter had no desire to sit upon that monstrous thing of twisted swords. Let the realm see that he was a humble steward, not a usurper. At least that was the story he so carefully spun. But how many swords had truly gone into forging that seat? 1,000, some said. Or was it fewer? Such trifling details mattered little. The symbolism mattered greatly. He allowed the throne to remain vacant for the time being. He would stand at its base when he passed judgments, or walk around it when meeting with ambassadors, so that no one forgot it was empty and yearned for a king. He, of course, had no intention of crowning anyone. But the illusion of a vacant throne was essential, especially as he cultivated a reputation as the caretaker, the patient regent who awaited the true heir, whoever that might be, if he deemed them worthy. And if they were not, a rumor or a black deed in the night would fix that. A faint laugh escaped him. In the war-torn 7 kingdoms, rumor was mightier than half the swords in Westeros. Swords required iron and arms. Rumor required only a breath. He was a master of rumor, though he'd garnered a reputation for the sword as well, more precisely, for placing the right swords at the right throats at exactly the right time. Yet it was rumor that had elevated him here, rumor and betrayal and alliances purchased with cunning. Now all the great houses were forced to come to him, or risk being devoured by the unrest that festered like an open wound across the realm. He lingered, letting the silence wrap him in a cloak of possibilities. Far from silent, the realm was simmering with tension. To the north lay House Stark, battered by war, facing rebellious lords who questioned the loyalty of any who had bent the knee to the Iron Throne after the death of so many Starks. To the west, the Lannisters still held Casterly Rock, a fortress bristling with gold and pride, but even they were not immune to the precarious nature of debts and shifting alliances. In the Vale, the boy Robert Arryn was still alive, though overshadowed by a regent more cunning, Peter Baelish himself, ironically, but that matter was safely under control. In the Reach, House Tyrell was battered by the aftermath of civil strife, struggling to maintain supply lines. The Stormlands had seen multiple pretenders rise and fall, but each new flame only singed the region further, leaving the war-wearied lords uncertain which new standard to rally behind. In Dorne, the Martells bided their time, as they always did, with serpentine patience that matched Peter's own. The Iron Islands were in a state of near chaos, with fractious captains and petty lords vying for power, uncertain how to carve their place in a realm that had grown wary of their raids. Meanwhile, as always, the Riverlands bore the brunt of every clash, their once fertile fields scorched by armies that marched or retreated, all of them following or opposing one claim or another to the Iron Throne. Yes, it was a realm on the brink, and Peter now stood as the slender thread that pulled them away from total collapse, though he allowed them to remain perilously close to that collapse. Fear was a powerful tool. Let each house remember that the alternative to Peter Baelish's dominion was unending war. Let them see that only through him could their positions be secured, their children protected. He was the caretaker, the only man with the skill to juggle their competing ambitions and keep them all from each other's throats. Or so the story went. In truth, he intended to keep them just near enough each other's throats to remember who it was that kept them from sinking in their teeth. He strode forth, content. An hour later, he slipped into a small solar he had claimed for his private use. There, by the glow of a single candle, he unfurled several letters, each bearing the sigil of a great or middling house. The flood of correspondence had not abated since his appointment as protector. Every hour, ravens arrived with news, pleas, threats half-veiled as warnings, or invitations that brimmed with nervous courtesy. He read them, tapped his fingers upon the desk, then replied to each one with the careful script of a steward who sought only to keep peace. He offered reassurances, subtle alliances, open enticements for cooperation. Each letter was meticulously worded, with paragraphs that seemed to promise much but in truth said little. The hidden thrusts lay behind a handful of carefully chosen phrases or omitted greetings that carried meaning in the labyrinth of courtly speech. Each letter would sew another thread of advantage, tying a new suitor or petitioner more tightly to him. Even as he wrote, a knock came at his door. Ser Marwyn of the Gold Cloaks, one of Peter's newly placed captains, stepped inside, bowing low. "My lord, Lord Varys has been seen near the docks." The man paused. He took ship from Pentos a fortnight past, apparently. Dock workers claim he was asking after old acquaintances among the whores and sailors. But we lost him once he slipped into an alley. A ghost of annoyance flickered across Peter's features. The spider. That bald eunuch had been a master of whispers under one king after another. Peter had often matched wits with him in King's Landing, each step and counterstep forging a grudging respect. Varys had disappeared in the chaos that engulfed the city after King Tommen's demise. Some said he'd gone east, others claimed he had died. But if he was returning now, that spelled potential complications. Peter could not predict whom Varys might serve, or even if the eunuch served himself. Varys had once professed to serve the good of the realm, but Peter found that notion laughably naive. Everyone served themselves in the end, no matter what they claimed. "Keep searching," Peter said mildly. "Discreetly. I want word of his movements. If you catch a glimpse of him again, follow from a distance. Let him think we are ignorant of his presence until we have enough proof of his aims. Then, if it suits me, we will speak." Sir Marwyn bowed once more. "Yes, my lord." He withdrew. Peter smiled again, though there was a flinty edge in his eyes now. So Varys had returned, had he? Well, 2 spiders in one web might prove interesting. He dipped his quill in ink and continued with his letters, but his mind was turning over the possibilities, weaving new contingencies into the mental labyrinth where he planned each move. Let Varys come. Let him conspire. Peter had spent years learning to read men's secrets, to sense their angles. He would handle the eunuch. When Peter had finished, he sprinkled sand on the wet ink, then folded the parchment. He might well use Varys's presence as a new impetus for the lords to cling more closely to him. They feared the spider's knowledge, after all. Everyone in Westeros had secrets they dreaded seeing the light of day. If he painted Varys as an imminent threat, perhaps Peter could glean more concessions from the lords paramount. He stood, massaging the stiff muscles in his neck, and then retired to his private chambers for a few hours of rest. He was not a man who slept long, for to him, the hours of darkness were when the greatest opportunities beckoned. Let other men snore away half the night. Peter's vantage was that he was never truly at rest, never truly off his guard. His dreams, when he allowed himself to drift that far, were always shallow, filled with the flickering forms of coins, knives, the swirl of a woman's skirts, the anguished cries of men who found themselves undone at his hands. In his dreams, he was unstoppable. In his waking life, he intended the same. When the sun rose, he broke his fast on bread, honey, and fresh fruit, alone. By the time the rest of the court awoke and began milling about the Red Keep, Peter had already received a half-dozen visitors. The first had been a representative from the Iron Bank of Bravos, a tall, hawk-nosed envoy who came to discuss the crown's debts. Peter put him off with practiced aplomb, reminding him that many lords had pledged to assist in stabilizing the realm, that trade routes would soon open more fully, that revenues would increase. He sprinkled in just enough detail to reassure the man that gold would flow soon, and that under no circumstances should the Iron Bank consider cutting off the finances that, ironically, underpinned half of Peter's manipulations. Then came a minor lord from the Stormlands, whining about bandit raids. Peter feigned concern, promised to dispatch a small contingent of men, and recommended the lord reinforce his holdfast in the meantime, perhaps with a loan from the crown at a reasonable interest rate. Another tie in Peter's net. And so the day continued, each small meeting another strand of control. By midday, he entered the throne room, where an audience had been arranged for emissaries of several great houses. They stood in tension-laced lines, each waiting their turn to approach the dais. Peter did not sit in the Iron Throne, but he stood near it, just a half step to the side, as if guarding it. That was the posture he liked best, neither usurping nor relinquishing, a place that reminded everyone who truly held power. Lord Royce of the Vale was first. Though older and grayer, he bowed stiffly. Peter noted how the man's jaw worked as though swallowing some bitter fruit. "My Lord Protector," he began, "I bring news from the Vale. We have had difficulty collecting taxes in some of the outlying regions. The lords there, staunch believers in the old ways, are resisting new levies. They claim to owe no new duties until a rightful king sits the throne." Peter's eyes narrowed in mock sympathy. Indeed, the Vale is known for its proud traditions. He paused, letting the silence press upon Lord Royce. "Yet, as I recall, these times require greater unity. The roads have been ravaged by bandits, and the gold to pay for guards must come from somewhere. Would these proud lords prefer chaos? Perhaps they have no taste for travelers being robbed, or shipments failing to reach their markets." Lord Royce tugged uncomfortably at his collar. "No, my lord. It is simply that they fear the Vale is asked to provide more than its share. We are not the only region in need of stability, after all." Peter offered a genial inclination of his head. "Quite true. And yet, House Aaron stands among the pillars of the realm. Surely, if it sets an example, others will follow. He made a show of glancing at one of his advisors, who dutifully recorded the conversation. Please see that these outlying lords are reminded that their loyalty to the protector is but an extension of their loyalty to the rightful king, for whom I but stand in stewardship. Lord Royce stiffened, his thick mustache bristling. I shall do so, he said, though he looked distinctly ill at ease. That will be all, Peter said smoothly, dismissing him. Lord Royce walked away, shoulders rigid. Next came a delegation from House Tyrell, led by a cousin of the main family. They petitioned for assistance in ensuring safe passage of supply wagons through the Crownlands, as the harvest had been delayed by weather and brigands. Peter, with the same measured courtesy, assured them the Crown would lend resources to guard those wagons. At a modest fee, of course, one which might be forgiven if House Tyrell saw fit to send a significant portion of the harvest to King's Landing at reduced cost. The cousin accepted the terms but made a visible attempt at hiding his discomfort behind a forced smile. On and on it went. Lords and ladies, emissaries and knights, each approached with a problem or request. Each left bound tighter to Peter's designs. He concluded the day's audience by mid-afternoon. As he departed the throne room, he overheard hushed murmurs. A few whispered resentments, a few reluctant compliments. Some might have cursed him under their breath, but none dared openly defy him. He allowed himself a small, thin-lipped smile as he walked away. In the corridors, he was met by Sansa Stark, though she traveled now under the name Elaine Stone to most. She approached tentatively, eyes downcast. Since he had spirited her out of King's Landing some time ago, claiming her to be his natural daughter, he had carefully cultivated her presence when it suited him, made her vanish when it did not. She was older now, her face losing the last traces of childhood, replaced by a womanly grace that drew eyes in court. Peter kept a close watch over her every move. "My lord," she said softly, "we've received another request from the north. They wish for White Harbor to be restored to its full status as a free port. Lord Wyman Manderley's men have been sending ravens." Peter hummed. "Yes, the Manderleys have been persistent. They see an opportunity to expand trade now that we are forging new shipping routes, and they want to ensure they do not pay excessive taxes." Sansa nodded, looking ill at ease. "Shall I respond as you instructed?" "Indeed. Remind them that the realm depends on equitable trade, but that certain levies are necessary to rebuild after the wars. We will consider relaxing those levies if White Harbor pledges a portion of its revenues directly to the Crown for the next 2 years." He paused, letting his gaze rest upon her face. "And, my dear, ensure you write it in a tone that suggests we are most sympathetic to their plight. We want them to believe we are on their side." Her eyes flickered. "Yes, my Lord Father," she said, using the lie that had become second nature. "I shall." He offered her a brief smile and touched her arm. The fatherly gesture was superficial, though it retained a certain disquieting familiarity he knew she did not like. Part of her still clung to the old northern sense of right and wrong, of black and white. Peter found it almost charming in a naive way. Yet he had noticed over these recent months that she had grown more composed, more able to mask her feelings. He wondered at times if she was learning from him, or if she simply endured, waiting for the day she could escape. Either way, he had her in his keeping. When she was gone, he resumed his quiet pace, heading now to a side courtyard. There, in the shade of a massive oak, stood Bronn, once a sellsword, now newly elevated to the lordship of some minor keep that Peter had arranged to be vacated. Bronn gave him a cheeky salute. "My Lord Protector," he said with a grin. "Everything's in place for tonight." "Good," Peter said. He liked Bronn well enough, for Bronn was straightforward. Coin, wine, women, that was all he wanted. He had no illusions of honor or higher virtue. Men like that could be bought, and usually stayed bought, provided they were well fed. "I trust you understand the arrangement? Don't kill him unless you say so," Bronn recited in a bored tone. "Rough him up, but not too much. Make certain he knows who allowed him to keep breathing." Peter nodded. "The same man will be traveling with a letter that suggests alliances detrimental to me. I want that letter. If it's what I believe it to be, we'll have reason enough to extract far more than a beating." Bronn shrugged. "He's crossing the Rosby Road near dusk. My men will handle it, then deliver him to the cellars. Use the cellars in the old tower, not the dungeons under the Red Keep. I don't want any official record of it." Bronn gave a wolfish grin. "Subtlety. I can do that." Peter parted ways. This incident, too, would be woven into the tapestry. Rumors suggested that Lord Tarly, one of the Tyrell bannermen famed for discipline and harsh leadership, had grown dissatisfied with Baelish's ever-tightening hold on trade in the Reach. Tarly had potential allies among the Stormlords, who also chafed under the new taxes. Peter needed to ensure that any budding coalition was strangled in its crib. A direct confrontation would be too obvious. Better a quiet, staged bandit attack that resulted in the disappearance of Tarly's messenger. Later, Peter would produce evidence that disaffected bandits were plaguing the roads, encouraging Tarly to rely more on crown protection. Tarly would be forced to pay higher fees and vow his loyalty even more explicitly if he wanted safe passage for his men. So spun the cycle. Grievance, solution, deeper entanglement. Peter was quite content with it. That evening, he dined with a small circle of lords and ladies. Wine flowed freely, tongues loosened. He offered compliments, teased out hidden resentments, and steered the conversation like a boat along a meandering river. Sansa, at his side, remained mostly silent. She had long since learned that her role was largely ornamental in such gatherings. Sometimes she might drop a carefully prepared remark that Peter had coached her to deliver. Tonight, though, he wanted her presence to encourage the illusions that the realm was stable, that a family dynamic existed around him. His daughter was living proof of his paternal care, or so the gullible might think. He watched the lords. Their eyes flickered to Sansa, lingering on the gentle arc of her cheekbones or the copper sheen of her hair. He saw the flickers of avarice in their gazes. Perhaps they dreamed of marrying her, forging a bond to Peter that might elevate their own ambitions. The notion amused him. None of them would have her. For the time being, she was too valuable in the position she held. After the meal, the company retired to a small salon. The lords and ladies took seats on cushioned chairs or perched on window ledges, continuing to chatter about trivial gossip while Peter orchestrated the conversation. He dripped small bits of scandal into the talk like a man feeding morsels to a pack of strays, watching them scramble. By the end of the evening, at least 2 petty alliances had formed, while another seemed on the verge of fracturing. A typical night, in other words. He excused himself, stepping outside to the courtyard for a breath of fresh air. The night sky gleamed with stars, and the soft hush of water dripping into a fountain soothed him. Moonlight lent the Red Keep a ghostly pallor. His mind drifted to the war that had raged across the land. There had been a time when the War of the 5 Kings threatened to tear the 7 kingdoms asunder. Countless thousands had died. In the ashes, houses had fallen, leaders lost, entire bloodlines severed. The Targaryen girl across the sea, who had once caused so much rumor and alarm with her dragons, had been, well, Peter had arranged enough interference that she never managed a triumphant landing. Her fleet scattered, her cause lost. She might still live or she might be dead. The rumor changed from month to month. Either way, she had no immediate presence here in Westeros. He had made sure of that. By the time she could have launched a real invasion, it was too late. And so the field lay open, and Peter stepped into the vacuum. Now, more than ever, he found himself at the center. Protector of the realm, the man to whom every letter was addressed, the man in whose name taxes were levied and armies kept in check. If a threat arose, it was Peter's men who took to the road to quell it. If a dispute flared, it was Peter's voice that set the terms of arbitration. He often recalled the day, years ago, when he was nothing more than a minor lord's son from the Fingers, mocked by highborns like Brandon Stark or Hoster Tully. Look at him now. The realm lay in the palm of his hand, though few realized just how firmly it rested there. He closed his eyes, letting the night breeze stir his hair. The only question that remained was, how long did he intend to maintain this role of caretaker? Part of him savored the idea of eventually claiming the throne outright, taking a crown for himself. Yet that would be too overt, too easily challenged. Better to remain the permanent regent, the forever protector, whose authority was unassailable because it was not couched in the same precarious legitimacy that had devoured one king after another. By always standing at the side of the throne, he could not be easily displaced. After all, he could point to the empty seat and say, "I serve the rightful king," while ensuring no rightful king ever emerged. Still, he dreamed sometimes of the day when he might ascend those iron steps. Perhaps in secret, at night, alone, he would sit upon the throne, just to see how it felt, the metal biting into his flesh. Yes, that might be enough for him, to know he could, but to choose not to. He allowed himself a small, indulgent chuckle. Then he turned back inside, returning to his bedchamber to await the next day's intrigues. In the days that followed, tidings arrived from every corner of the realm. Many were the same: demands, pleas, updates. Some, however, set Peter's carefully tuned senses on alert. Word from the Lannisters indicated growing restlessness among certain bannermen. A rumored alliance was brewing between a disaffected faction in the west and the ever-bold Euron Greyjoy, who styled himself King of the Isles. Peter responded by dispatching a clever trade envoy to the Iron Islands. He had no illusions about Euron's appetite for chaos, but a bribe here and a threat there might keep the Ironborn busy raiding some distant coast, or perhaps even attacking an emerging power Peter found inconvenient. As for the Lannisters, he intended to pen a letter that would stroke their pride while warning them of the dangers of any open conflict, reminding them how swiftly the realm could descend into full-scale war once more. And where would the Lannisters' position be then, with half their gold spent and their alliances shaky? Meanwhile, from Dorne came an invitation extended by Prince Corran Martell, who had succeeded to power after the old line was broken. The Dornish seldom forgot slights, nor did they easily forgive. Peter weighed whether to accept the invitation for a friendly visit. Dorne was cunning, and the Martells had once nearly undone the Lannisters from within. If Peter traveled there, he would be stepping into a viper's nest. But sometimes that was the best place to gather venom for one's own dart. He penned a cautious reply that said he would be delighted to attend in due course, but the matters of the realm weighed heavily upon him, so it might be some time before he could do so. In truth, he would watch and wait, letting Dorne stew in uncertainty. Perhaps he would send an envoy instead, an expendable piece on his chessboard. The North remained fractious. Though House Stark had nominally reclaimed some measure of order under a newly recognized warden, the scars from the wars ran deep, and many northern lords were reluctant to bow to any southern protector. Peter had not yet decided how best to handle the North. Perhaps a new wave of wildling raids would soften them, remind them how much they needed southern support. He had men in place near the wall, men who could easily foster an incident or lure certain wildling factions into crossing. Or perhaps he should simply starve the North of trade until they came, hat in hand, begging for the supplies they needed to endure the next winter. So many options, so many ways to bring the proud wolves to heel. Of course, that touched upon a tender point: Sansa Stark's presence, the name she was forced to relinquish publicly. Peter sometimes toyed with the idea of revealing her identity, forging a marriage alliance to secure the North. But it might be too risky. The northern lords might rally behind her, demand a real Stark as queen, or push for autonomy. That would complicate matters. For the moment, it was best to keep Sansa's secret in the shadows, letting the North drift in confusion. He missed nothing, not even the minor lordlings who scurried about King's Landing, seeking favor or trying to curry advantage. One night, a certain Lord Gaunt, a threadbare noble from the Stormlands, cornered Peter in a corridor, stammering about how badly his lands had fared in the war and how heavily the taxes fell upon him. Peter listened with gentle sympathy, nodded at the man's plight, and extracted a small but crucial pledge: that Lord Gaunt would lend a portion of his troops to the Crown's next campaign in exchange for a partial relief of taxes. It was a shrewd bargain, for while Peter might lose a fraction of coin from the Gaunt lands, he gained loyal swords, ready to be deployed at a moment's notice. Over the next few weeks, Peter engineered half a dozen such deals, quietly assembling a shadow force of various house contingents who owed direct service to him. It was an insurance policy. Should any major house attempt to challenge his authority or place a puppet on the throne, these scattered but loyal swords could strike swiftly from multiple directions. Meanwhile, the city itself was kept just content enough. Grain shipments arrived regularly, though Peter orchestrated them in such a way that the city's inhabitants were always slightly worried about shortages. Prices rose and fell unpredictably, while the crown's agents occasionally distributed bread at a discount. These small gestures of benevolence kept the populace from rioting, made them see Peter as a stabilizing force. Not a beloved presence, surely, but enough to maintain order in a city perpetually teetering on the edge. The gold cloaks patrolled the streets, dealing harshly with thieves and cut purses, but also with any rumors that might undermine Peter's hold. Word of a secret heir or a hidden claimant was swiftly quashed. The city lived in a tenuous calm, not truly peaceful but too frightened of chaos to lash out. From time to time, Peter found amusement in social diversions. There were feasts, masquerades, and small gatherings in hidden corners. He enjoyed playing the gracious host, plying lords and ladies with wine and flattery, all the while eavesdropping for bits of blackmail or hidden ambition. He never drank to excess, preferring to keep his wits razor-sharp. He'd watch others drink too much and let slip some indiscretion. Then, quietly, he would glean an advantage. He had done this for years, even before the realm recognized his cunning. Now, with 100 more pairs of eyes on him, he conducted himself more carefully, but the principle remained the same. People were coins to be spent, debts to be collected, or pawns to be moved. In those same days, another matter arose that he hadn't entirely foreseen. Word arrived from the free cities that mercenary companies were shifting their loyalties. Peter had occasionally used them to stir trouble or fight in his interests abroad, but now something was changing. Rival factions in Pentos, Lys, and Myr were consolidating. One day, a messenger arrived under the banner of the Golden Company, an organization famed for their motto, "Our word is good as gold." They had once supported Targaryen pretenders, but now they sought new contracts. The messenger, a lean man with a scar across his cheek, requested an audience with the protector, offering the company's swords in exchange for a future partnership. Peter demurred, telling the man courteously that Westeros was at peace under his stewardship, and there was no large-scale conflict requiring so many cells words. The messenger, smiling thinly, said the company would stand ready, should the tides ever change. Peter smiled in return, aware that the Golden Company might well be an excellent resource if he needed to wage a sudden war of subjugation. There was no reason to turn them away entirely, so he instructed the messenger to remain in King's Landing for a time, enjoying the city's hospitality. Peter would see whether such a large mercenary force might be useful soon. As the weeks turned to months, it grew impossible for the lords to ignore that Peter's position was not weakening. If anything, it was solidifying. They might privately call him Littlefinger, a term meant to mock his minor heritage, but none called him that to his face now. They addressed him as Lord Baelish or my Lord Protector, with forced smiles. Children who were once told stories of gallant knights and rightful kings heard new stories of cunning men who rose from nothing. Some admired him for it, saw him as an example that birthright was less important than ambition. Others despised him, believed he was the ruin of the realm and that a rightful monarch must emerge to cast him down. But no one seemed able to produce such a monarch. A bastard here or there might claim Targaryen blood, but Peter swiftly discredited them or had them vanish. A scattered rumor that Edric Storm, King Robert's bastard, might lay claim to the throne was whispered, but never found traction. Edric Storm had fled Westeros, or so it was said. The realm was exhausted from war, so exhausted that many lords muttered that perhaps it was best to accept Baelish's governance, at least for now. At least the roads are safer, some would say. At least we have bread in the markets, others would grumble. Slowly, the small council reshaped itself around Peter's will. He replaced or exiled those who chafed under his authority, elevated those who owed him. He let them squabble over trifling matters, like how many casks of wine were allocated to the Red Keep, while he maintained control of the treasury, the spy networks, and the armies. He rarely raised his voice, never lost his temper. He had no need to. Fear and favor were his instruments. In private, he sometimes felt a pang of longing for the simpler days, when he was master of coin and could operate from the shadows, when he could pretend to serve kings or regents who never understood just how dangerous he was. But that was the old game. He had ascended to a new level now, where the realm itself bent around him. It did not truly matter who saw him coming, because no single power could move against him without the rest of Westeros collapsing into anarchy, and none of them wanted that. So they tolerated him more or less. He found that ironically amusing. So many lords had once boasted of their lineage, their right to rule, only to kneel before a man from the Fingers. He took a small measure of quiet glee in that, but he knew better than to overplay his hand. He would not give them cause to unite against him. Instead, he fanned their rivalries, set them at mild odds with each other, always stepping in as the arbiter. Thus, each house feared the other houses more than they feared him. Yet not all news brought him pleasure. Word came one day of the Tarly messenger who had been ambushed on the Rosby Road. Bronze men had followed Peter's instructions, but in the struggle, the messenger had lost a finger and a half to a particularly zealous thug. The man, delirious with pain, had spilled more secrets than Peter expected, revealing that Tarly had been in talks with certain Baratheon loyalists to unite in rejecting Baelish's taxes. The letter was found, as Peter predicted, but it was short on details. No matter, Peter had the messenger thrown into the old tower's cellars, where he was kept half-starved. In time, if Peter needed more information or a scapegoat, he'd see how talkative the man might be. As for Tarly, Peter penned a letter, neither accusing him nor admitting knowledge of the plot. Instead, he sent courtesy, condolences, and a subtle threat hidden between the lines, reminding Tarly how easily misfortune could befall those who traveled unprotected. Within a fortnight, Tarly relented and resumed paying the taxes in full. Another rebellion quashed. In the Vale, there arose another concern. Young Robert Arryn's health deteriorated further, the boy's fits growing more frequent. Maesters whispered that he might not live another year. That was no tragedy for Peter, who had served as Lord Protector of the Vale in all but name. Yet it raised the question of who would inherit the Vale. Some Vale lords believed the seat should pass to a Royce or a Corbray if Robert died. Peter had no intention of letting that happen without placing someone loyal in charge, or at least someone betrothed to Sansa. He weighed the options, still uncertain how best to play that card. Perhaps a marriage that united the Vale and the North, with Peter as the guiding hand behind it all. Sansa would not thank him for it, but her gratitude was irrelevant. She was a chess piece, albeit a prized one. Late at night, he would sometimes walk alone in the Red Keep's older passages, places even the guards seldom went. The ghosts of old kings and queens seemed to whisper in the halls. Aegon the Conqueror, Maegor the Cruel, the Targaryens who followed, the Baratheons who supplanted them, the Lannisters who overshadowed the Baratheons, even the fleeting power of the Tyrells. All had come and gone. Now none had dominion but Peter Baelish. He almost wished one of them were alive, to see how a simple boy from the Fingers had outmatched them. But the dead did not speak. They lingered only as cautionary tales. He began to notice that certain watchers were trailing him. No doubt Varys's little birds, or perhaps a new set of spies in service to some foreign entity. He took steps to mislead them, letting them see him enter a chamber for a clandestine meeting, only to find him gone when they searched. He'd slip out through a hidden door or a secret passage. The Red Keep had many, and he knew a fair number of them from his time as Master of Coin. A few nights, he set traps for these watchers, allowing them to overhear a fabricated conversation that suggested something scandalous or conspiratorial. He enjoyed imagining their confusion when the leads came to nothing. If Varys was behind them, Peter hoped the eunuch's frustration was mounting. One evening, though, as Peter made his way back to his solar, he nearly ran headlong into a figure who slipped from the shadows. For a moment, his heart kicked up in his chest. He was not a warrior, after all, and his hand twitched toward a hidden dagger. But then the figure murmured in a familiar, velvety voice, "My Lord Baelish." No need for alarm. The flicker of a torch revealed Varus himself, clad in the drab attire of a common court official. His soft features set in a faintly amused expression. He inclined his head. "You seem well, my Lord Protector. Thriving, indeed." Peter forced a neutral smile. "Lord Varus, I heard rumors you had returned to the city. I wondered when you might pay me a call." Varus fluttered his hands in that old habit. "I have been reacquainting myself with the little birds. They chirp that all is changed in King's Landing. They also chirp that nothing ever truly changes, only the masks worn by those who hold power." Peter's eyes narrowed a fraction. "A cynic might say so, but the realm is at peace, thanks to me." "Of course," Varus purred. "Peace is a fine thing, no doubt. I recall, though, that you once told me chaos was a ladder. And you, my dear Lord Baelish, appear to have climbed it splendidly." Peter did not let the sudden flash of annoyance show on his face. He shrugged. "I do what is necessary to preserve the realm. I learned from the best. You had your talents in that regard, I recall." Varus offered an obsequious smile. "A flattering recollection. And now that I'm returned, shall I find a place in this new order? Or shall I quietly remain in the shadows as a disinterested bystander?" Peter read the subtext. Varus was offering to align or threatening to meddle. Perhaps both. "I have no immediate need for a master of whisperers," Peter replied smoothly. "But I'd not mind the counsel of an old friend. The city is large, and I hear your ear is quite adept at listening." "How gracious," Varus said, bowing. His eyes were unreadable. "I shall consider your generosity." Then, like a puff of air, he was gone down the corridor. Peter stared after him, mind racing. Varus had always claimed to serve the realm, but Peter believed the eunuch served only his own illusions of stability, or perhaps hidden cause. In any case, it would be wise to keep Varus close, or at least watch him closely. If the spider's webs became too tangled, Peter would see them burned. The next morning, Peter convened a small meeting with his most trusted associates. Sansa was there, silent as ever, along with a handful of men who owed him everything. Bronn, Ser Marwyn, and 2 lesser lords who had bankrupted themselves in the wars and now depended upon Peter's gold. He told them of Varus's reappearance, instructed them to keep eyes on the eunuch's movements, and told Sansa to watch for letters bearing any foreign sigils that might come to the keep. If Varus had an agenda involving the Martells or the Targaryen exiles, Peter would know of it. Time rolled on, the swirl of intrigues continuing like a steady dance. Peter rarely left King's Landing, preferring to have the lords come to him. An old adage about war said that the man who stayed behind his castle walls was the man who let the enemy come to him on his terms. In politics, it was much the same. But eventually, an issue arose that demanded his presence outside the city: the marriage of a key Lannister cousin to a highborn lady from the Westerlands. It was to be a grand affair near Lannisport, and nearly every major house was sending representatives. Peter considered refusing, but the Lannisters still commanded respect and gold in the West. A personal appearance might placate them, remind them that the Protector valued their status, all while letting him sniff out any new conspiracies forming. He decided he would attend, bringing a lavish entourage. He set out with a column of men, gold cloaks, servants, and a few knights of unimpeachable loyalty. Sansa, disguised under her alias, rode in a carriage. Along the King's Road, peasants and merchants paused to gawk at the procession. The war had left many of the roadside villages impoverished, the fields half-tilled. Peter made a point of instructing his men to distribute a few coins in each hamlet. Acts of charity, small but visible, so that rumor would spread of the Protector's generosity. Meanwhile, behind the scenes, he assessed the farmland, noting which lords had neglected their duties, which might be ripe for confiscation or exploitation. When they reached the borders of the Westerlands, a mounted party of Lannister men greeted them. The red and gold lion fluttered on their banner. Their captain seemed polite, if a touch wary. They escorted Peter and his retinue to the wedding site, a sprawling castle overlooking Lannisport's deep harbor. The place was bedecked with flags and garlands. The smell of roasted meats and fresh bread drifted on the ocean breeze. Lords, ladies, knights in shining armor, and lesser men jostled in the courtyard. Peter dismounted, handing the reins to a stable boy. He swept into the castle's halls, where the bride's father, Lord Lefford, greeted him with effusive courtesy. Not to be outdone, a Lannister matriarch approached, stepping in with sly compliments about how the realm benefited from Peter's guiding hand. He played the role of the gracious guest, dispensing well-chosen pleasantries. If the Lannisters were looking for signs of weakness, Peter aimed to disappoint them. Over the next 2 days, festivities abounded. Feasting, tourneys, dancing. Peter watched from a raised dais as knights jousted. Every so often, he'd clap politely. The Lannister bridegroom, a strapping young cousin of the main line, seemed determined to impress. He unseated a few lesser knights in the lists, drawing cheers from onlookers. Peter smirked to himself. Strength of arms had its place, but cunning was the blade that truly cut deepest. He allowed himself a small wave for the triumphant Lannister knight. Let them enjoy their spectacles. Real power was forged in letters, secrets, and alliances. After the tournament, he wandered the castle's corridors, gleaning what gossip he could. Tension simmered among some Western lords, particularly those who had lost wealth in the war or grown resentful of what they saw as the crown's extortionate taxes. Peter listened carefully, smiling whenever anyone looked his way, storing every snippet. Then, in a private chamber, he held a conversation with Lord Daemon Marbrand, a respected bannerman to the Lannisters who quietly admitted that some sought a restoration of true monarchy. "A caretaker," Lord Marbrand said with forced politeness, "can only do so much, my Lord Protector. We need stability that lasts across generations." Peter offered a mild shrug. "A noble sentiment, my lord, but as you know, every attempt to seat a monarch has ended in bloodshed. The realm is weary of war. Would you subject your people to another round of conflict on the off chance that a new king might hold the realm together?" Marbrand pursed his lips. "We might not have to. If the next monarch was chosen with broad consensus, someone from a line respected throughout Westeros, perhaps no one would contest it." "Perhaps," Peter said with a faint smile. "And who would that be? A Targaryen with a questionable claim? A Baratheon bastard no one respects? A Lannister with too many enemies? A Stark child who has no real support in the south? I fear the realm is too fractured for consensus." Marbrand sighed, conceding the point. "We shall see, my Lord Protector. One day, the realm will want more than a caretaker." Peter only inclined his head. "One day. But until then, I remain at its service." It was not lost on him that Marbrand was fishing for a weakness. If the Lannisters or any other faction found a plausible figurehead, they might try to rally support against him. But Peter had confidence in the myriad strings he pulled. Without the help of the crown's treasury or a massive alliance, no claimant could gather enough momentum to unseat him. And if one ever approached that threshold, Peter would sabotage them before they could unify too many lords. The realm's war weariness was his shield. By the wedding's end, Peter had reaffirmed his sway over the Westerlands with a combination of charm and veiled threats. He departed with gifts from the Lannisters, including some fine gold work. He accepted graciously, though he smirked inwardly at the irony. Once upon a time, the Lannisters had loaned money to the crown. Now, they found themselves almost in Peter's debt, fearful of losing the crown's favor. Times had indeed changed. On the return journey, ravens brought news that the Iron Bank of Bravos was growing restive, dissatisfied with the schedule of repayment. Peter considered the matter. He could pay the bank off using gold he had seized from rebellious lords or from new taxes, but it might be more advantageous to keep the debt partially outstanding. The Iron Bank liked to invest in outcomes they believed profitable. If Peter reduced the debt entirely, they might feel free to bankroll a rival. Better to keep them entangled, not too upset but not fully paid. Perhaps it was time for another partial payment, just enough to placate them. He penned instructions for the Master of Coin in King's Landing, ensuring a shipment of gold would depart within the month. That would keep the Bravosi content. When Peter arrived back in the city, he found it stirring with fresh rumors. Varys was said to have met with certain merchants in Flea Bottom. An assassin was rumored to have been caught near the Red Keep walls. Sansa told him that a new letter from Dorne had arrived. He read it quickly. Prince Corn Martell was suggesting a meeting in neutral territory, a location along the Dornish marches, where both sides could discuss trade routes and the possibility of betrothals. Peter weighed it. A betrothal might unify Dorne with the rest of the realm under Peter's guidance. Perhaps it would be wise to orchestrate some marriage that anchored Dorne's loyalty. The Martells had a reputation for cunning that nearly matched his own, so he would approach carefully. He wrote back, expressing interest in a future meeting, but did not commit to anything. That was the essence of Peter Baelish's style. Never commit until the path was absolutely clear, never shut the door entirely on any option. The days turned into a blur of letters, audiences, secret meetings, and carefully calculated gestures. House Tully, battered by the wars, tried to reassert some influence in the Riverlands, so Peter permitted them a slight reduction in taxes, winning their temporary gratitude. The Tyrells, seeing Tully's preferential treatment, demanded more favorable terms for shipping their grain, so Peter forced them into a new agreement that granted them some concessions while also binding them to produce additional wagons for King's Landing. The North sent an envoy to discuss the matter of the Night's Watch, whose numbers had dwindled dangerously. Peter agreed to send criminals and prisoners to the Wall to bolster them, but at the same time, he cut the Night's Watch's direct funding to remind them of their dependence on the crown. 100 small moves, each forging or reinforcing a chain. The more complicated the tapestry, the less likely any thread could break free without unraveling the entire pattern. Occasionally, Peter would show himself before the masses in the city, riding with a modest escort to inspect the gates or the docks. The people would bow or mutter curses under their breath, but no one rose in open rebellion. Not yet. He ensured the gold cloaks watched carefully for any sign of unrest, quietly removing agitators before they could rally a crowd. He had no appetite for butchery in the streets, too damaging to his aura of benevolent caretaker. Subtlety was better. Those who threatened him simply vanished into the night, and rumors blamed everything from foreign spies to old vendettas. Among the Red Keep's corridors, Peter's presence was ubiquitous. He was there in the small council chamber, leaning forward with a polite expression while lesser men debated. He was there in the library, reviewing old records of land claims and genealogies, no doubt searching for potential threats or pawns. He was there in the gardens, exchanging pleasantries with ladies who fluttered their eyelashes at him, though he seldom indulged any of them beyond flirtation. Always moving, always listening, always weaving new threads. Sansa Stark, for her part, grew quieter. She was a beautiful ornament, yes, but she had also become more watchful. Peter noticed it in the way she would look at him sometimes, as if trying to see through his measured smiles. He wondered if she might eventually attempt to break free of him. But to go where? The North was in turmoil, and any mention of her true identity could spark a conflict that might see her dragged into a forced marriage or worse. For now, she remained by Peter's side, writing letters at his behest, attending social functions, radiating the kind of quiet dignity that made him appear more respectable. He allowed her that role as it was useful, and if she ever became a liability, he would deal with her as he had dealt with so many others. He doubted it would come to that. Sansa, like most in the realm, had nowhere else to turn. Winter was approaching, though the full depths of it remained uncertain. Reports trickled in of early snows in the mountains, poor harvests in some regions. Peter saw an opportunity. He began stockpiling grain in secret warehouses, letting the price edge upward. Then, when the populace grew anxious, he released small amounts to the markets, winning gratitude. Meanwhile, he was prepared to sell the rest at a premium if certain lords needed it desperately. Such manipulations, while profitable, also served to keep the realm dependent on him. A lord whose people starved was a lord who would do anything to feed them. Late one evening, as snow flurries danced beyond the windows, Peter stood in the Red Keep's high tower, peering out across the slumbering city. His breath fogged the glass. All was calm. All was his. He recalled the days when he was a nobody, a laughingstock. He recalled how Caitlin Tully once promised to never see him again. In the end, she died, and he had kept going, kept climbing, kept scheming. He recalled the moment he pushed Lisa Aaron through the moon door, his own wife, disposing of her like a broken toy. Now, every great house bowed to his authority in one form or another. Yes, they might resent him, they might conspire behind closed doors, but none had the power to overthrow him outright. Was this contentment? Perhaps, in a sense. Peter had always believed that real joy lay in the chase, in the conquest. Now he had conquered the entire game, or enough of it to feel secure. He still found subtle challenges to amuse him. Anticipating how Dorne might act, guessing which rebellious whisper might spring from the Lannisters, or how the North might attempt to reassert its ancient independence. But none of it truly threatened his position so long as he stayed vigilant. Protector of the Realm. That was the title. Once, kings had soared and plummeted in quick succession, undone by war or betrayal or by their own missteps. Peter had made himself the caretaker, the man behind the throne. But it was no longer behind the throne. It was all around it, in every corridor, in every chest of gold, in every rumor that flitted through the taverns, in every levy demanded by the crown. It was in the hearts of the small folk, who dreaded a new war more than they dreaded an endless caretaker. It was in the hearts of the lords, who balanced their own ambition against the risk of open conflict. Peter Baelish was the realm now, inextricably tied to it, and the realm would not soon be rid of him, unless it tore itself apart in the process. So he gazed upon King's Landing, the biggest city in Westeros, and felt the quiet thrumming of triumph in his veins. He had done it. He had risen from nothing, from the bleak shores of the Fingers, to rule over the ashes of kings. And he intended to rule for a very, very long time. He turned, footsteps echoing on the stone floor, and descended the steps. He would rest now for a few hours perhaps. Even the spider must sleep in its web. But come morning he would resume the dance. Another flurry of letters, another audience with the small council, another labyrinth of deals. The lords of Westeros would scramble and maneuver, but they would find themselves, as always, trapped. He was the guiding hand, the man who kept the realm from tearing itself to pieces, the man they could not afford to dislodge. And if sometimes he felt a pang of regret for those he had betrayed or the blood spilled, he reminded himself of what the realm would look like without him. Chaos, that was his old friend. He had ascended beyond it, harnessed it, and now he stood above them all. Peter Baelish, Lord Protector of the Seven Kingdoms, had become a fixture in Westeros. The Iron Throne remained empty, a silent symbol of the power he refused to claim outright. Some said that in quiet hours he would creep to the throne, run his hands over the jagged steel, and whisper to it. Others said he found the seat hideous and never looked at it. The truth was, he sometimes stood beside it, one hand on the armrest, imagining all the might-have-beens and the might-yet-bes. Perhaps one day he would decide to seat himself upon it, just for the spectacle. But for now it was enough to know that no one else could. And so the city's torches guttered in the cold wind, the waves lapped at the shores, and the ravens carried messages across the realm. The houses plotted, the small folk toiled, the storms rose in the distance. Through it all, Peter Baelish remained the unassailable figure at the center of the web. Whatever came next, be it a resurgence of dragonspawn, a wildling invasion, a foreign invasion, or another internal war, he would stand ready, smiling his thin smile, whispering his offers of assistance, dealing his double-edged deals, always one step ahead. Westeros, battered and broken, had become the ultimate prize for a cunning man with no scruples, and Peter Baelish had taken it. There he would remain, the protector of the realm in name, but in truth its undisputed master. He closed his eyes that night, alone in his chamber, hearing only the hiss of the wind. He dreamed of the banners of every great house laid at his feet. He dreamed of the hush in the throne room when, at last, he mounted the steps, the swords clinking beneath his boots. He dreamed of the hush when he turned and surveyed the empty hall, and realized that there was no one left to challenge him. Only then did he wake, The city outside was still dark, the sky still star-flecked. He breathed out, a slow exhalation. Dreams, illusions, the patterns of power, what was the difference anymore? He slipped from his bed, donned a robe, and padded quietly to a small table where maps lay unrolled. The entire realm sprawled before him. Tiny markers indicated the seats of power, lines marked roads, script noted the alliances he had forged. Satisfied, he traced a hand over the lines. So many battles fought, so many pawns moved. But the game continued as long as men strove for power. He bent his head over the map, considering the next move. And across the silent corridors, the faint scuttling of shadows suggested that he was not the only one awake. The castle never truly slept. But as long as Petyr Baelish ruled, it would never truly dream of a future without him. He would see to that. Petyr Baelish often thought of chaos as if it were a fire that he could stoke or smother at will. Now, as the seasons turned and winter's breath blew more boldly through the streets of King's Landing, he could feel that fire ever smoldering beneath the surface of his realm. The realm was his. He would not call it otherwise, despite that empty throne standing in the great hall. The illusion of caretaker remained a convenience, but he knew the truth well enough. No man, woman, or child held more power in the 7 kingdoms than Petyr Baelish. Whether they reviled him or respected him, they had all come to rely on him. He let that awareness warm him through the cold nights. Outside the windows of his chamber, the city's rooftops were dusted with frost in the pre-dawn gloom. A hush filled the twisting alleys, broken only by the distant bark of a dog or the clank of a watchman's boot on stone. Petyr had been awake for hours. Sleep came to him only in brief intervals. Too much needed his mind. He stood over a small table that bore the weight of a dozen new scrolls. By the flickering glow of lantern light, he unfurled them one by one. In each letter lay a piece of the puzzle that was Westeros. Demands from lords, pleas from minor houses, schemes from bravos or pentos. Some letters were masked in coded phrases, others bold in their desperation. He read them all with the same faint curl of amusement on his lips. At that table, he came across a sealed message bearing the sigil of House Manderly. White Harbor's mark, a merman with a trident, was pressed into the wax. He broke the seal with careful precision. Over the past year, he had orchestrated a precarious trade agreement that enriched both the crown and the Manderleys, but it remained delicate. The letter contained a polite but urgent request for protection against raiding ships rumored to be ironborn. The letter added that the Manderleys wished to expand their naval capacity, albeit at crown expense. Petyr arched an eyebrow. Already they sought to use the specter of ironborn aggression as leverage to gain more ships. He set the parchment aside to consider a measured response. Certainly, he could dispatch some crown vessels, no doubt with the help of whichever lords might require new debts to keep afloat. The Manderleys would glean a modicum of security, and he would bind them more tightly by controlling the purse and the promise. All of it was typical, precisely the sort of arrangement that kept the realm under his thumb. When he finished with the Manderley letter, his attention drifted to a small scrap of parchment that had arrived without sigil or seal. On it was scrawled a few sentences. Rumor of a golden-haired pretender claiming lineage to House Lannister, or to the Baratheons, or both. Likely nonsense. These faint claimants appeared from time to time, but rarely posed a danger, especially when Petyr's watchers fed them to the crows before they ever reached a critical mass of support. He flicked the parchment aside like a piece of lint. If it became anything more than an idle rumor, he would handle it. He had ways of sniffing out those who nursed ambitions of kingship. A soft footstep drew his gaze from the table. Sansa, Elaine to most, stood in the doorway, eyes shadowed. She wore a modest gown of dark green, her copper hair pinned back. Even in the subdued light, she was lovely in a quiet, sad sort of way. Petyr offered her a thin smile, which she answered with a tentative dip of her head. "My lord," she said, voice hushed. "Ravens came from the Vale while you slept. Ser Marwyn asked me to deliver them when you woke." She extended 2 sealed messages. Petyr took them gently, noting the Vale moon and falcon sigil on one. The other was plain. In so many matters, the Vale needed only to be reminded that House Aaron's delicate child, Robert, could not stand on his own. Peter had served as regent for the boy once, and that had given him a lasting hold over the region, though many of its lords resented him. Now they wrote again, no doubt with more requests or fresh concerns. He glanced at Sansa. "You have read them, I presume?" She shook her head. "No, I left them sealed." "I would not." He waved a hand, interrupting her. "I would not have minded if you had, my dear. You might as well be prepared. You are privy to enough of my dealings as it is." Sansa pressed her lips together. She never seemed entirely comfortable with the notion that these letters were manipulations in progress, each one a stepping stone in a labyrinthine plan. Perhaps a vestige of her father's stark sense of honor lingered in her. Yet Peter suspected she understood more than she let on. The easy flush in her cheeks when she was younger had faded, replaced by a guarded caution. She knew better than to defy him openly, and if she secretly resented it, well, that hardly mattered. Peter counted on her loyalty so long as she had nowhere else to turn. He opened the first letter. As expected, Lord Royce was complaining that the Vale must send more men to patrol the mountain passes. Banditry had grown. The clans of the Mountains of the Moon were rumored to be more active. There were even tales that the savage clans had discovered deeper tunnels leading toward the north. Royce wanted gold, men, and the authority to pacify them. Peter suspected that Royce merely wanted the funds to maintain a personal army, perhaps to intimidate other Vale lords. Peter tapped the parchment thoughtfully, then opened the second letter, from the young steward of House Corbray. That letter claimed that Lord Lionel Corbray had fallen ill, leaving a potential succession issue. The steward requested the protector's guidance. Peter let out a quiet exhale. Ailing lords meant new power vacuums. It was a pattern he knew well. The Vale was teetering between multiple lines of inheritance. Good. That confusion suited him. He laid the letters aside and looked at Sansa. "Thank you, my dear. Let Ser Marwyn know I will prepare a response shortly, and he will dispatch ravens by midday." She nodded, hesitated as if she wished to speak further, but then departed silently. Peter watched her go, contemplating whether she might still have any illusions about her family's legacy. If so, he would find a way to quell them. The Starks were all but spent, the North battered by endless wars. If House Stark rose again, it would be only through Sansa, and only if Peter allowed it. He found the notion faintly amusing. He paused at the window, letting the frosty air prickle his skin. Dawn's earliest light began to seep through the horizon, painting the sky in pale grays and pinks. The city below stirred. He could hear faint noises. Shopkeepers unlatching doors, fishermen hauling crates from the docks, the distant rumble of cart wheels. His domain, each person a thread in the tapestry he had woven. He liked to take this moment, now and then, to remind himself that this was real. He was not master of coin or just some cunning petty lord. He was the protector, the man who enforced a measured peace upon a realm that had known too much chaos. It was his chaos if he chose to unleash it again. He took a quick meal of bread and boiled eggs, then made his way to the throne room. The great hall felt colder than usual, the stone floors leaching warmth from the air. A few scattered courtiers awaited him, shuffling their feet for warmth. The Iron Throne, as ever, loomed empty at the far end of the hall. Peter stepped before it, refusing to sit, letting his presence by that twisted steel speak for itself. The courtiers bowed. He recognized them. A minor Redwine cousin from the Arbor, a pair of landed knights from the Crownlands, and an envoy from the Stormlands. Small matters. He listened with half an ear as they pleaded for lower levies or better trade terms. He gave carefully poised answers, the type that carried a veneer of compromise but obligated them even more deeply. Next came the Master of Laws, a gray-bearded man named Harold Sunglass. He was one of Peter's appointees, plucked from relative obscurity in the Crownlands, indebted to Peter for the position. Sunglass reported that the city's crime had risen slightly, thievery, mostly, in the cold months. Peter replied that the bread dole should be adjusted to keep the small folk mollified. He reminded Sunglass that the gold cloaks must crack down on agitators who spread dangerous rumors. If the city was hungry, they must look to the crown for relief, not blame the crown for any shortfalls. Sunglass bowed and scurried off to pass the orders along. With these small matters concluded, Peter dismissed the gathering. That left him with the emptiness of the grand hall. He stood there, eyes on the iron throne. His hand twitched slightly, as if he might place it on one of the sword points. Then he drew back. The screech of metal echoed in memory. He could still recall the times he had watched men vie for that seat, only to bleed. The throne had seen too many unworthy claimants, and Peter preferred not to bleed. It was better to be the man behind the illusions of power. He left the throne room, heading for the solar where the small council would convene. Along the way, he spotted Ser Marwyn exchanging words with Bronn, the Sellsword turned lord who still wore a cocky grin half the time. Bronn gave Peter a curt nod in passing, and Peter flicked a glance at him in acknowledgement. Bronn still had his uses. He could do the dirty work Peter preferred remain unofficial, and he was bluntly predictable in his motivations. Gold, comfort, and a sense of smug invulnerability, that was all Bronn needed. Entering the solar, Peter found the usual group. The Master of Coin was a thin, fussy man from the Reach, placed there specifically because he obeyed Peter's every instruction. The Master of Ships was a half-competent noble from the Westerlands who had lost much of his family's fortune in the war. The Master of Laws, Sunglass, arrived moments later, still flushed from their talk in the throne room. In a seat near the window was the Grand Maester, an old fellow with a watery gaze, prone to dozing. No Master of Whisperers sat among them, for Peter had never named a formal replacement for Varys. It amused him to see the uneasy glances they sometimes cast toward that empty seat. The meeting commenced with discussions about port fees in King's Landing, the cost of reinforcing certain roads, and a handful of local lords petitioning for judgments in property disputes. Peter listened, letting the council babble. After all, it was good for them to feel important. When they seemed to circle around pointless details, he would interject with a directive or a rhetorical question that steered them toward his desired outcome. One might think the small council would resent his mastery, but most of them welcomed it. It saved them from making difficult decisions. By the end, the council had agreed to raise certain tariffs, reduce the bread dole fractionally, in the name of encouraging local production, and dispatch 100 gold cloaks to quell unrest in a distant Crownlands district. Peter nodded, satisfied. The meeting adjourned. As the others filed out, the Grand Maester lingered uncertainly. Peter turned to regard the man, who clutched a small scroll in his trembling fingers. "My Lord Protector," the Maester said, voice thin. A raven arrived from the wall. "They speak of troubling signs in the far north. The Night's Watch begs for more men and supplies." Peter took the scroll. Indeed, it bore the black wax of the Watch. He read the gist of it. Rumors of strange sightings in the haunted forests, glimpses of pale creatures at night, and wildling tribes fleeing deeper into the forests. The Watch insisted they needed more resources, more swords, or else the long night might again threaten the realm. Peter handed the scroll back with disinterest. "We have already seen to the Watch's needs, have we not? An ongoing arrangement of prisoners to swell their ranks, as well as regular shipments of grain." He recalled the arrangement he had made. Criminals from King's Landing jails, as well as petty thieves from other regions, were sent to the wall in lieu of punishment. It saved him the trouble of feeding them in the city, and it supposedly helped the Watch. The Grand Maester nodded. "Yes, my lord, but the letter claims the situation is dire. They speak of an unnatural cold, of whites. Stories to frighten children," Peter cut in. "The Night's Watch has always insisted on such pleas, especially in a harsh winter. They can have a small additional allotment, but I will not waste precious resources on folktales. The realm has real threats to consider." He thought of rebellious lords, raiders, and the intricate politics that kept him in power. Certainly, if the others truly existed as more than old myths, Peter would have heard of more tangible proof by now. Rumors alone did not concern him. The Maester hesitated, but then bowed and left. Peter exhaled slowly. The old man had a superstitious streak, as many maesters did when it came to the supernatural. Still, Peter supposed it wouldn't hurt to keep an ear open for further signs. He would task some of his watchers along the neck to pay attention. If a wave of wildlings truly headed south, it might become an inconvenience or an opportunity. The North would then need him more than ever. He moved on to his next duty of the day, a private audience with a lord from the Stormlands, Lord Wild, who wanted permission to rebuild a certain fortress on the crown's coin. Peter greeted him with polite courtesy in a small receiving room. A pitcher of wine stood on a side table, but Peter did not offer it. Sometimes withholding minor comforts made visitors more anxious to please. Lord Wild was a stout, sweaty man whose cloak was threadbare at the edges. "My Lord Protector," Wild began with a forced bow, "I come humbly to beg your approval for the fortification of Rain House. The Stormlands have faced repeated raids from outlaws and sellsword companies on our coasts. We require a strong defense." Peter noted the tremble in the man's voice. He was desperate. Repeated raids, or so he said. Peter suspected the lords in that region often exaggerated bandit threats to secure coin. "Indeed, security is paramount," Peter replied lightly. "Yet the crown's coffers are not bottomless. What do you propose in return for such an investment?" Wild blinked, as if he hadn't considered that question carefully. I can offer additional men to the crown's service, to be dispatched wherever you require, my lord." Peter folded his hands. "How many men?" The man sputtered a moment, naming a number that was laughably small. Peter gave him a tight-lipped smile. "Your loyalty is appreciated, my lord, but that number will hardly sway the crown's decision. We might consider partial funding, if you pledge more significant resources, say, half your knights for a year's service whenever I call upon them." Wild swallowed. "Half, my Lord Protector? That would leave my lands." "Your lands threatened by the same outlaws we propose to fight, yes." Peter gave a mild shrug. "But if Rain House is truly so vital, your men behind those walls can defend it. The knights you pledge to the crown need not remain in your domain. Perhaps we shall station them strategically in the region. A show of force might deter these raids better than any one fortress." Wild looked cornered. Peter suppressed a small surge of satisfaction. I suppose we can manage that if that is your will. Then we have an accord. I will see that the Master of Coin allocates a portion of funds for your rebuilding efforts. Do keep me informed." Peter rose, signaling the end of the audience. Wild bowed and stumbled out, obviously unhappy but too fearful to resist. Peter's smile deepened once the door closed. Another chunk of the Stormlands, bound to him. More men effectively under his command if he needed them. That evening, he attended a feast in the Red Keep, a smaller affair meant to entertain a delegation from Pentos. They arrived with silks and spices, bearing gifts for the Protector, presumably hoping to secure favorable trade with Westeros. Peter moved among them like a fish in water, exchanging pleasantries with the Magister of Pentos. The conversation turned to shipping routes across the narrow sea, the threat of pirates near the stepstones, and the question of taxes on foreign merchants. Peter dropped small hints of lowering those taxes if Pentos would invest in certain crown ventures. The Magister's eyes gleamed with interest. By the end of the evening, the Pentoshi left with smiles and half-promises, while Peter was confident he could wring a healthy tribute from them in due time. All the while, courtiers in the hall cast glances at Sansa, who appeared briefly at Peter's side in the guise of Elaine Stone, his dutiful daughter. She wore a modest gown, her hair braided. She did not speak much, but she was courteous when spoken to. Some lords eyed her, perhaps considering the potential alliance a marriage could bring. Pleased Peter that they considered it. Any who approached him on the matter, though, would find his answer politely non-committal. In that way, Sansa remained a valuable chip to be played later, if ever the need arose to tie two houses together. A few nights later, Peter received word from Bronn that the captive Tarly messenger, snatched weeks ago, was still rotting in the old tower cellars. He had revealed the last of his secrets. Tarly's frustration with Baelish's taxes, the attempts at covert alliances with Stormland lords. Nothing new had emerged that Peter hadn't already guessed, so he gave Bronn leave to dispose of the man. Whether that meant a quick death or a quiet release in some corner of the city was Bronn's choice. Peter cared little, so long as the man never reappeared to cause trouble. When he conveyed this to Bronn in private, the Sellsword nodded with his usual casual shrug. "I'll see to it," was all he said, a faint smirk on his lips. Meanwhile, the presence of Lord Varys remained a subtle undercurrent in King's Landing. The bald eunuch appeared occasionally in the shadows, greeting Peter with a silky courtesy. He claimed he was merely reacquainting himself with the city, content to serve the greater good. Peter knew better. He suspected Varys had his own network of whispers. He might be peddling information to foreign dignitaries or waiting to cultivate a new pretender to the throne. Still, Peter wasn't alarmed. With every attempt Varys made to gather secrets, Peter's watchers quietly trailed him. If Varys stepped beyond certain lines, Peter would orchestrate a final solution. For now, the spider kept his distance, offering no direct challenge. Sometimes they would exchange false smiles in a corridor, each acknowledging the other's cunning. It was almost like old times, two men dancing around a bonfire of secrets, neither wanting to get burned. The months passed in a measured rhythm. Peter's hold remained steady. Reports of small skirmishes or outlaws dotted the realm, but no large-scale rebellions arose. Lords might grumble at feasts, might nurse private resentments, but they lacked the unity or resources to threaten Baelish's guardianship. House Lannister, still flush with gold, tried now and then to exert its influence. They sent politely veiled letters reminding Peter of historical precedents, how the West expected certain privileges in trade, how the seat of the Iron Throne had once been tied to them by marriage. Peter responded with flowery politeness, offering them trivial concessions while quietly exacting new tariffs. He suspected they hated him, but that hatred remained cold, for they had no single figure behind whom they could rally. The name Lannister alone did not mean what it once had, not with Tywin, Cersei, Jaime, and Tyrion all gone or diminished. And so the gold at Casterly Rock sat, and the realm remained Baelish's. The Tyrells in the Reach, similarly, could not unify enough bannermen to challenge the crown. The Martells in Dorne still lingered with cautious hostility, but no open break occurred. Each time they tested him, Peter offered an olive branch with one hand and showed a hidden blade with the other. Meanwhile, the Greyjoys in the Iron Islands remained fractious, especially under Euron's unpredictable hand. Peter sometimes funneled gold to certain Ironborn captains, encouraging them to raid elsewhere rather than along the major trade routes that kept King's Landing supplied. An occasional nudge or bribe was all it took. The North, battered by harsh winters and still haunted by the ghosts of old wars, sent minimal protest. House Stark's name had a powerful mystique, but the actual power behind it was fragile. They had lost too many capable leaders. Even the surviving lords were cautious, remembering how the last great rebellions cost them dearly. Many had no appetite for another southern war. Whenever the North grew too restless, Peter would relax a levy or two, toss them a small boon, anything to keep them from seeking independence in earnest. He knew the northern spirit well enough to realize that if pushed too hard, they might break away entirely. But if he gave them just enough to quell their anger, they would remain uneasy but obedient. So the realm slogged onward into winter, the cold intensifying. In King's Landing, the skies stayed leaden more days than not, and the rains came chill. Snow seldom stuck for long, but the damp air made every stone and timber drip with gloom. Fires burned in every hearth of the Red Keep, and Peter ensured that the city was provided just enough fuel to avoid widespread suffering. A starving, frozen populace might rebel, but a hungry, worried populace was more easily controlled. He struck that balance with the finesse of a juggler keeping half a dozen knives aloft. From time to time, a hush would settle across the court when the question of the Iron Throne rose anew. A few lords dared to hint that a recognized king or queen might better unite the realm, especially now that winter threatened. They spoke of the realm's morale, the value of a single ruler to rally behind. Each time, Peter offered his usual gentle deflections. Talk of a rightful heir was premature without a recognized claimant, and the war that might spring from forging a false claim would do more harm than good. The realm had endured too much bloodshed. Better to trust the protector's stewardship until a clear, indisputable heir could be established. Which would never happen, of course, so long as Peter had any say. Some courtiers nodded in reluctant agreement. Others fumed in silence. None dared to openly challenge him. Yet for all his vigilance, Peter could not be everywhere at once, nor could his watchers sense every whisper. Late one night, a pair of figures met in a deserted chapel tucked behind a row of crumbling houses near the city walls. One figure was short, clad in a cloak of dark cloth, and moved with the quiet grace of a skilled observer. The other was tall, wearing a hooded cape, features unseen. They talked in hushed tones, so softly that even the rats in the rafters hardly heard them. Silver coins changed hands. A snippet of parchment, sealed with no sigil, was passed from one to the other. Then they parted ways, disappearing into the labyrinth of King's Landing. Peter's men did not see, for he had not suspected these two to conspire. The next morning, one of Peter's many watchers did notice something odd. Tracks leading into that old chapel, but not out. Yet by the time he investigated, the chapel was empty save for a single burnt-down candle. He reported it to his superior, who dismissed it as likely vagrants. The matter might have ended there had not another piece of intelligence arrived from the docks. A foreign ship with false registration had sailed in, stayed only a single night, then vanished before dawn. Peter's watchers found no definitive link, but the coincidence pricked at them. They reported it up the chain. Eventually, the matter reached Peter himself. He listened calmly as Ser Marwyn explained the suspicious comings and goings, arms folded behind his back. They stood in a small courtyard where the morning light lit up frosty shrubs. "My Lord Protector," Ser Marwyn concluded, "there is little solid evidence, only the word of a dock worker or two. The ship called itself the Seafire, yet no such vessel is listed in the harbor logs of Pentos or Liss, and the men who came off it were not seen at any inn." Peter drummed his fingers against his sleeve. Curious, could be smugglers, or perhaps a covert envoy from the Free Cities. He wondered if Varys might be behind it, or if some rogue group of lords were summoning outside help. Possibly the Iron Bank looking for leverage. Ensure a quiet watch is placed on any suspicious ships hereafter. Let it be known that smuggling in the capital's port will bring swift punishment. Ser Marwyn bowed. "Yes, my lord." He hesitated. "Shall we further investigate the old chapel?" "Discreetly. If we press too hard, we'll learn little. If we show disinterest, we might lure the conspirators into acting again. I want watchers posted at a distance. Nothing more." Peter smiled thinly. "If they return, we'll be ready." Days passed without sign of the hooded figures returning. Peter let the matter occupy only a sliver of his attention. He had more immediate tasks, responding to a new Martell letter that insisted on meeting at the Dornish marches, smoothing over an argument between House Stokeworth and House Rosby over disputed farmland, coordinating with the Tyrells to ensure the flow of grain. He was due to host another feast soon, welcoming an envoy from Volantis. Through these dealings, he never lost sight of the realm's precarious balance. So many pieces, each reliant on him to keep the peace. Sansa drifted in and out of his presence like a shadow, always respectful, never venturing a strong opinion of her own. If he asked her to copy a letter, she did so. If he asked her to stand by him at a reception, she stood, silent and poised. Sometimes he sensed a well of sadness in her, a yearning that lingered behind her eyes. He'd catch her standing at a window, looking northward as if her thoughts wandered beyond the horizon. On occasion, he wondered if she was plotting something, but he saw no sign of real rebellion. She was effectively alone, dependent on his protection. If she tried to flee, she had nowhere to go, no allies in the city. And if she somehow reached the north, that might spark a new war, one that would not end well for her or the Starks. So he let her stand at windows, let her brood, so long as she continued to serve his narrative. Winter's chill deepened. Snow occasionally dusted the city, turning the winding streets into slippery warrens of ice and slush. The cost of firewood rose. Peter ensured that the Red Keep had ample supplies, but the small folk had to scramble, paying higher prices. He arranged limited charity, distributing some firewood and bread in the poorest districts, enough to keep them from revolting. Rumors circulated that this winter might be the longest in a generation. The lords who remembered previous long winters grew uneasy. Some urged Peter to stockpile more grain from the Reach and the Riverlands. But Peter refrained from draining those regions too heavily, not wanting to provoke them into open dissent. Instead, he carefully balanced demands, letting each region think the other was paying more. The realm continued, bruised but functioning. One afternoon, a raven from the north brought unexpected tidings. It seemed small folk near the last hearth had encountered wildlings fleeing south. The wildlings spoke of terror in the far north, of dead men walking, of an endless night. The Umbers, who held last hearth, expressed alarm. They requested immediate assistance from the crown, for if these tales were true, the threat could be monstrous. Peter read the letter with a faint curl of disdain. The living dead? That old story again. During the War of the Five Kings, the Night's Watch had similarly cried warnings, but the realm had been too consumed with its own battles. Now, with the realm tenuously at peace, these stories emerged anew. Perhaps the Watch used them to secure more supplies, or perhaps the wildlings sought pity. Peter had no intention of dispatching a large army to the freezing north based on ghost stories. He did, however, sense an angle. If the north was afraid, they might become more pliable. He penned a response to Lord Umber, expressing polite concern but offering only a token force of crown men. Mercenaries, effectively, if the north paid for their upkeep. He also stated that the north must keep the crown informed of further developments. He made sure the letter conveyed compassion and paternal wisdom. The protector cares for all corners of the realm, but resources are limited, so we must work together. A cunning pitch. He sent the raven off satisfied. That very evening, a slip of parchment arrived under Peter's door. No seal, no signature. It read, "They gather in secret. Beware the night in the old chapel. A friend." Peter stared at the note. For a moment, he wondered if it was Varys. It seemed like the eunuch style, but Varys typically employed more cryptic references. Perhaps it was one of his watchers or an entirely different conspirator. Either way, it confirmed that the chapel might be in use again. Peter wasted no time. He summoned Bronn, told him to position men discreetly near the chapel that very night. If they see anything suspicious, they are to capture the conspirators alive if possible, Peter said. But do not reveal their link to me. Bronn grinned. Understood. A quiet snatch. Later, Peter returned to his chambers, mind turning with possibility. He set aside some time to read a volume on the genealogies of distant Targaryen bastards. If there was a pretender lurking about, the conspirators might be preparing to present them as a candidate for the throne. That thought intrigued him more than frightened him. Another false king could become a useful scapegoat. He closed the book, resolving to stay awake until word came back from the chapel stakeout. The hours crept by. Outside, the city dozed under a crust of ice. Shortly before midnight, Bronn appeared in Peter's solar, face lit with sardonic satisfaction. He carried a few items wrapped in a cloth bundle. "We bagged 2 of 'em," he said without ceremony. "A third got away, might have been a woman, but not sure. They were meeting by candlelight, as predicted. My men had to chase down the short one. The tall one drew a blade, so we ended him. The short one's alive, but took a blow to the head." Peter nodded calmly. "No one saw, just a couple of street vagrants. We paid 'em to keep quiet, threatened them if they didn't. Shouldn't be a problem." "And the one who escaped?" Bronn shrugged. "Vanished into the warren of alleys. My men gave chase, but she was quick. Dark cloak. We couldn't get a good look at her face." Peter exhaled. "We shall have to be satisfied with one prisoner, then. Where is he now?" "In the old tower cellar, same place as that Tarly messenger. Tied up and gagged. He's barely conscious." Bronn held up the cloth bundle. "He had these on him." He unwrapped a small iron key and a scrap of parchment. The parchment was blank save for a smear of dried candle wax. "Might be some code or hidden writing," Braun said with a shrug. Peter took them, eyes narrowing on the key. It bore no markings. The wax on the parchment suggested it could hold a secret if heeded, or it might be nonsense. "I'll examine these later," he said, setting them aside. "For now, keep him alive. I'll question him personally." "Did they say anything before capture?" Braun gave a lazy grin. "He babbled something about the rightful heir and the city will rise." Sounded half mad. Peter's lips curved. "That's enough of a clue. Let's see if we can coax out the rest." He dismissed Braun, then prepared to visit the tower. He did not intend to dirty his own hands with torture. There were experts for that, but he preferred to witness the man's face, his reactions. 15 minutes later, Peter descended the winding steps to the damp cellar, flanked by 2 of his loyal guards. Torches lit the cramped space. The stench of mold and stale air clung to the walls. The prisoner was bound to a chair, a rag stuffed in his mouth. He was indeed short, perhaps a half-foot shorter than Peter, and wiry, with a bruised temple and blood caked at his hairline. His eyes flicked up in panic as Peter entered. "Remove the gag," Peter murmured. One guard obeyed. The prisoner coughed and spat, glaring wildly. Peter took a slow breath, letting the torchlight cast flickering shadows across his face. "Do you know who I am?" The prisoner said nothing, but his lips trembled. His eyes darted to the side, as if seeking a way out. The cellar had only one door, guarded by 2 men with swords, so he had no hope. "I am Peter Baelish, protector of the realm." Peter's voice was a silken thread. "And you, my friend, were meeting in secret. Some might call that treason." "Treason?" the man rasped. You have no right to hold the throne." "Ah, but I do not hold the throne," Peter said, mild as milk. "I merely keep it safe until a rightful claimant is found." "Who exactly do you serve? Whose cause do you champion?" He studied the man's eyes. The prisoner hesitated, jaw clenched. "A true king. One who will not let the realm fester under your vile manipulations." Peter smiled faintly. "And who might that be? A Targaryen? A Baratheon? A secret Lannister bastard? A Stark with a hidden claim? Or some new name you've concocted?" The man's breath came ragged. "We need not name him to the likes of you." Peter flicked a glance at one of the guards, who stepped forward with a small iron tool. The prisoner tensed, sweat beading on his brow. Peter raised a hand, halting the guard. He knelt to the prisoner's eye level, speaking softly. "It would be a mercy if you told me now. I am not a cruel man by nature, but I must protect the realm from foolish plots. If there truly is a rightful heir, I might be inclined to hear their claim." He let a thread of false sincerity creep into his tone. For a moment, the prisoner's eyes shone with desperate hope, but then he shook his head, as though recalling who stood before him. "You speak poison. I will not betray the cause." Peter sighed. "Pity." He turned to the guard. "Give him a taste, but do not destroy him yet. I want him able to speak." The guard advanced with the tool, and the prisoner's face twisted in terror. A short, strangled cry filled the cellar, mingling with the echo of dripping water. Peter stepped back, letting the guard do his gruesome work. Only a minor bit of pain, but enough to remind the prisoner that defiance was costly. The man's scream subsided into whimpers. When the guard stepped away, Peter returned, voice smooth as glass. "Now again," he said. "Who do you serve? Who is this rightful heir?" The prisoner groaned, blood trickling from a shallow cut on his forearm. He spat on the ground. "You'll never find him, not in time. The lords gather in secret. When winter grows darkest, he will come forth." Peter's curiosity sharpened. "He? So a man, not a woman," he observed. "And he intends to wait? Why?" The prisoner opened his mouth, but instead of words, he forced a laugh that degenerated into a coughing spasm. You think you own us all. You're just a weasel with illusions. You'll see. You'll see." Tears leaked from his eyes, whether from pain or something else. Peter inhaled slowly, annoyance creeping in. We can continue this a long while. I'm patient. My men have many ways to persuade you. Shall we continue tonight, or do you wish to be sensible? The prisoner's eyes brimmed with hatred, but he said nothing more. Peter gestured to the guards. Stop for now. Keep him alive with minimal comfort and try again in a day or so. Perhaps I'll bring the toolkit myself if he persists in stupidity. One guard saluted. The prisoner let out a ragged breath. Peter departed, climbing back up the dank steps. The taste in his mouth was sour. The man had not revealed a name, but something about his words, "The lords gather in secret," uneased Peter more than the usual rants of would-be rebels. It suggested a coalition forming behind some candidate. Of course, coalitions had formed before and come to nothing, but usually Peter heard whispers sooner than this. A hush might indicate careful planning. That the man said they waited for when winter grows darkest also implied a more methodical approach. Perhaps they intended to strike when the realm's resources were stretched thin by the cold, or when Peter's supply lines were tested. That would be an opportune moment to incite a rebellion. He returned to his solar, pondering the possibilities. The tall figure had been killed, and one had escaped. Only this short man was left to glean information from. The key found on him, what did it open? The blank parchment with wax. Did it hide a coded message? Peter lit a candle and held the parchment near the flame, watching for invisible ink. Faint lines appeared, barely discernible. He could make out a rough shape like a crude map. A circle, maybe. Then the parchment blackened, turning crisp at the edges. He cursed under his breath and pulled it away too late. Most of the hidden script turned to ash. Still, he had glimpsed something that looked like a ring or a circle on a coastline. Possibly a location. That was not much to go on. The iron key was simpler. It might fit a chest, a door, or a lockbox somewhere in the city. The prisoner might reveal it if pressed. Or Peter might have the city scoured for a matching lock, though that could draw too much attention. He decided to see if the prisoner was more talkative after another session of persuasion. If not, so be it. Peter had reams of other tasks waiting. By the next morning, news arrived that the Volantine envoys had come ashore in the Blackwater Bay. He put aside the conspiracy for a time, focusing on the Volantine ambassadors, who carried themselves with the arrogance typical of that grand city. They wanted to discuss expanded trade and possibly the crown's help in dealing with pirates. Peter gave them a well-rehearsed smile, leading them into the Red Keep's audience chamber. Over cups of spiced wine, they described the rising cost of shipping along Essos's southwestern coast and expressed a willingness to pay for safe moorings in Westeros. Peter played them skillfully, hinting that the crown's own shipping lanes could be threatened if pirates grew bolder. He said all the right things to make them more eager for a deal. By the end, they were practically offering tribute. He left them with the sense that the Protector's favor was invaluable. Another success. But behind his pleasant mask, his mind lingered on the prisoner's words about a hidden gathering of lords. He decided to quietly expand his web of watchers. He dispatched coded instructions to men in the Reach, the Westerlands, the Riverlands, the North, and even Dorne. Watch for gatherings of unusual size, discreet comings and goings, or any sudden movements of troops. He extended additional pay to those watchers, ensuring their loyalty. If a cluster of lords was truly uniting behind some would-be monarch, Peter would know about it. It was possible the talk of rightful heir was nonsense. But Peter's instincts, honed over years, warned him not to dismiss it entirely. Sansa noticed his tension. That evening, as they walked together through one of the castle's galleries, she asked in her gentle voice, "Are you worried, my lord father? You seem uneasy." He glanced at her, assessing. "A trifling matter, my dear. There are always rumors of conspiracies. This one might be more elaborate than most, but I have weathered them before." She folded her hands. "I've heard whispers. In the castle kitchens, they say that a new claimant might come forth in the spring." Peter let a soft chuckle escape his lips. "Is that so? The kitchens are an endless source of gossip, seldom accurate. Nonetheless, I appreciate hearing it. It means the rumor has circulated enough to reach even the scullions. He paused, studying her. Perhaps you might encourage the rumor, see if you can lure out a name. Should you hear anything more specific, do bring it to me. She lowered her eyes. Yes, my lord. He placed a hand on her shoulder, a gesture of paternal fondness that always made her tense slightly. Worry not. No pretender can match the webs I've spun. The realm is at peace because I maintain it so. Sansa only nodded, her expression carefully schooled. Peter watched her for another moment, then continued on, mind turning to the next steps. Winter's shadows lengthened. In the great hall, braziers burned day and night to stave off the chill. King's Landing endured, though the small folk grumbled at the biting cold, the wet, the slim pickings of the fish market. Now and again, a message from the north would arrive with more dire warnings about the wildlings or rumored sightings of whites. Peter rationed out small increments of aid, never too generous. He also heard from the Umbers again, who insisted that the wildlings brought tales of a great army of the dead. Peter responded that such superstitions were best handled by the Night's Watch, not the Southern Lords. Let the North handle its own phantoms. When no major developments arose on that front, Peter's attention returned more fully to the elusive conspiracy. Over the next week, his watchers in the city reported that the old chapel remained deserted. The prisoner had been questioned further, but revealed only that the day of reckoning would come, that winter's darkness would cloak the rightful heir's rise. The man refused to provide a name or location. Peter ordered him stripped of food and left in the cellars. Time and hunger might break him where pain did not. One cold night, Peter was returning from a meeting with the Master of Coin when he turned a corner and nearly collided with Varys. The eunuch bowed with exaggerated grace. "My Lord Protector, how good to see you. You work late, as always." Peter noted the sly warmth in Varys's eyes. "Indeed, the realm's burdens do not sleep. Nor do you, it seems," Varys said, folding his hands. "I hear tell you've been quite busy dealing with certain disruptions in the city. Old chapels, secretive gatherings, dangerous times." Peter offered a faint smile. "I wonder from whom you heard such tales." "Why, from the little birds, of course. They sing of hushed footsteps and men who vanish." Varys tilted his head. "Shall I take it you have the matter well in hand?" "I do," Peter said. "It's hardly of consequence. A small nest of troublemakers, likely. Once they're stamped out, we'll have peace again." Varys pursed his lips. "One hopes. Yet I recall that even the smallest spark can grow into a blaze, if not carefully smothered." Peter's smile did not waver. "I am quite adept at smothering sparks. Thank you for your concern." Varys inclined his head. "Of course, my Lord Protector. May the Seven guide you." He slipped away into the corridor's gloom, silent as a whisper. Peter stood still for a moment, expression turning cold. Varys knew more than he let on. He always did. Perhaps the eunuch had gleaned details about the captive conspirator. Perhaps he was fishing to see how Peter would react. If Varys was in contact with these rebels, it might be to manipulate them for his own ends. Peter resolved to watch the spider even more closely. A few days later, as Peter was reviewing accounts in his solar, a coded raven arrived from his watchers in the Westerlands. It stated that a cluster of minor lords, including some from the Reach and the Riverlands, had traveled westward to a remote mountain holdfast. They claimed it was for a hawking expedition, but no hawking parties had been reported. The watchers suspected a secret meeting. Peter tapped the parchment, lips thinning. More evidence. So they had begun to move, quietly forging alliances far from prying eyes. The watchers had identified the presence of a certain Ser Davin Bainfort, known for his fervent devotion to the faith of the Seven, and Lord Brax, whose house was overshadowed by the Lannisters but historically bold in forging alliances. The watchers could not get inside the holdfast but saw ravens departing, presumably carrying letters. This was no mere hunting trip. Peter penned instructions back, urging them to follow any of the participants discreetly and try to intercept the ravens if possible. Then he wrote another letter, addressed to a mercenary captain in the Westerlands he had on retainer, ordering him to keep an ear to local chatter. At last, Peter wrote a private note to the Lannisters, hinting that some bannermen might be acting without their knowledge, possibly endangering the realm. He couched it in polite, uncertain terms, leaving them just worried enough to start sniffing around. If House Lannister discovered a plot on its own territory, they might clamp down on it themselves, ironically doing Peter's work for him. The next piece of news that arrived, however, came from the Stormlands. A wedding had been arranged between two lesser lords, but rumor said that the actual wedding was a cover for a clandestine gathering of Stormland nobles. Peter considered the possibility that multiple secret meetings were happening at once, possibly weaving a larger alliance. It reminded him of how the War of the Five Kings began. Quiet pacts, unspoken vows, small gatherings that exploded into open conflict. He would not allow that to happen without his knowledge. When the day came that the prisoner in the cellar finally broke, he offered scattered clues under the final wave of torment. He spoke of a castle by the sea, of old salt-stained banners, of a vow taken on a moonless night. Peter gleaned the sense that these conspirators believed in a king from the sea, or at least someone with a connection to coastal power. Possibly that hinted at the Iron Islands or a branch of House Velaryon from the days of old. Yet the man's ravings were jumbled. He also mentioned the dragon's tooth, which might point to Targaryens, or a symbolic reference. Peter had him pressed further, but the poor wretch died shortly after. His final words were an almost delirious laugh, claiming that the new king was already among you. Peter stood over the dead man's body with no emotion, ignoring the blood on the floor. The puzzle had deepened. A king from the sea with a dragon's tooth, with the conspirators referencing old salt-stained banners. Could it be a Targaryen descendant allied with the Ironborn? Or perhaps someone from the Velaryon line? House Velaryon had ties to the Targaryens once and possessed driftwood thrones on Driftmark. But that house had largely dwindled in significance. Euron Greyjoy was rumored to dabble in strange lore, once claiming to have a dragon horn, but that was likely rumor. Still, Euron's unpredictability might draw certain discontented lords if they believed he had a real claim or a fearsome artifact. Peter had no illusions. If Euron or any other upstart had a Targaryen relic that might galvanize those who craved a return to the old monarchy, they might see in it a rallying symbol. Delusion though it might be, symbols had power. He rubbed his temples, thinking. Euron Greyjoy was cunning, but hardly a stable figure. Could these conspirators be so desperate as to back a man like that? Stranger alliances had formed in Westeros's history, or perhaps another figure altogether was behind the rumor. He decided to intensify his watchers' focus on the coasts, especially around the Westerlands and the Reach, where the coastlines were extensive. He also sent word to the Iron Islands themselves, instructing his paid informants to watch for any new alliances Euron might be forging. If a large fleet began to muster, Peter wanted to know at once. Meanwhile, he quietly commanded the master of ships to keep the royal fleet ready, though not obviously so. Let them think the crown was complacent. Despite these undercurrents, the day-to-day life of the court went on. Peter continued to hold audiences, pass judgments, and manage the realm's finances. He sat through tedious banquets, listening to courtiers flatter him or else nibble at morsels of gossip. He danced with politics as gracefully as ever, offering small indulgences to this lord, imposing new obligations on that one. But a quiet wariness coiled within him. Somewhere out there, a genuine threat might be brewing. He was determined to crush it before it could bloom. Snow fell again, blanketing the city's rooftops, turning the White Sword Tower into a pale silhouette in the distance. Peter gazed from a balcony, sipping mulled wine. He recalled how, as a boy in the Fingers, he had once built a snowman with his sister, only for a storm to sweep it away the next night. That memory felt like another life. Now, his entire existence was encompassed by the Red Keep's labyrinth of corridors and the realm's restless factions. Snow was just another complication, making roads slippery, shipping riskier. Winter threatened famine, and famine threatened unrest. He had to navigate these perils carefully. He had staked everything on being the man who kept peace. If the realm starved or froze, the tenuous loyalty of the great houses might fray. Then a new pretender could find an opening. Not long after, a raven from the north delivered more ominous tales of walking corpses, of entire wildling villages emptied in the far north. Some southern lords began to snicker at these spooky stories, calling them the ravings of barbarians. But in the Vale, some lords took it more seriously, urging the crown to muster an army to march north. Peter batted away such calls. Marching north in the dead of winter was folly, an invitation to lose men to cold. He wrote letters praising the vigilance of the watch, promising that if the threat became real, he would act. But privately, he thought it more likely that the wildlings were just warring among themselves. The others, the White Walkers, those were tales older than the Undulls. If they had not emerged fully during the chaos of the War of the Five Kings, why would they do so now? Still, he dispatched a few scouts from the crown to accompany the next supply caravan to Castle Black. They would bring back first-hand accounts. Meanwhile, rumors spread that the Watch's new Lord Commander was frantic for aid. Peter smirked at the thought of some crow beating on the table, demanding the realm's attention. That seldom ended well. Let them caw. The realm had bigger concerns. The weeks ticked on, each day slightly colder. The nights felt endless. Some said that once the heart of winter arrived, the sun might vanish behind clouds for days on end. Peter sometimes strolled the castle at odd hours, as if searching for the conspirators in the gloom. He saw only flickering torches and heard only the sighing wind. Sansa, from time to time, would ask if all was well, but he always assured her it was, offering a gentle smile. One particularly bleak morning, she caught him studying the Iron Throne again. She said nothing, simply stared at him with a subdued expression. He wondered if she guessed his mind was churning with the question of how far he might go to crush a new rebellion. There was no doubt she understood that if it came to open war, thousands might die. Perhaps she recalled her father's fate or the horrors of the earlier wars. But she said nothing, merely curtsied and left him alone with the twisted swords. At last, new intelligence arrived from the Westerland's Watchers. They had followed a pair of suspicious riders, one of whom carried a sealed parchment. They managed to kill one rider, but the other escaped with the document. The Watchers found a partial letter on the dead rider, which referred to the Salt King and the old blood of Valyria, urging lords to gather in a place called Stone Beacon. Peter's eyes narrowed as he read. Salt King strongly hinted at an ironborn figure, someone recognized by that handful of rebellious or ambitious lords. Old blood of Valyria pointed to Targaryen ties, or at least a claim of such. Euron Greyjoy's rumored horn or some twisted claim to ancient bloodlines. Perhaps. Or maybe they had recruited a Targaryen bastard from Essos, forging an alliance with the Iron Islands. That would be an unholy combination of the sea's raiding might with a symbolic tie to the dragons. Enough to capture the imagination of certain lords who loathed Baelish's rule. Stone Beacon. Peter summoned his cartographers. They identified a place by that name on the southwestern coast of the Reach, a small outcropping near minor fishing villages, rumored to have an old watchtower. If that was where the conspirators planned to gather, or if it was a place they used to ferry a new pretender ashore, it demanded Peter's immediate attention. He wasted no time drafting new orders. He wanted a covert force of crown-loyal men sent to Stone Beacon at once. He would not approach openly with a large army that might spook the conspirators into scattering. Better to insert watchers, men who could blend into the local populace. Let them see who arrived with how many ships. Once identified, they could be ambushed or captured. Peter felt a cold determination settle in his gut. If a real threat existed, he would strangle it swiftly. He also took a separate step, sending a discreet letter to the Tyrells, who nominally held sway over that region. He claimed there might be ironborn raiding parties near Stone Beacon. He asked for their cooperation in rooting out any unlawful activity. He did not mention the suspected conspiracy. He simply painted it as a matter of coastal security. If the Tyrells moved men into the area, it would pressure any conspirators, though Peter hoped the Tyrells would not bungle it. He needed stealth, not a heavy-handed show of force. But even if the Tyrells warned the conspirators by accident, that might drive them into the open. Within a week, Crown agents arrived in Stone Beacon, blending as traveling merchants, fishermen, or pilgrims. They sent back coded ravens describing a small coastal town with little commerce in winter. But they noted an unusual influx of strangers from various regions. A few nights later, a battered longship, possibly iron-borne in design, anchored off the coast. Men in cloaks went ashore under cover of darkness. The watchers could not approach closely, but they heard talk of a secret meeting in an abandoned tower on the edge of the beach. Local fisherfolk were warned away, threatened with violence. A hush had fallen over the entire settlement. Peter read these reports by candlelight, his heart pounding with quiet intensity. This was no random speculation. Something real was happening there. The watchers heard references to a black wind, to the king who paid the iron price, and to the dragon awakened. All nonsense, or so it sounded. Yet it reeked of mystic posturing that the Ironborn sometimes loved. The watchers also claimed they glimpsed banners that might be a hybrid design, part kraken, part dragon, though they could not get close enough to confirm. If so, that sealed the matter. An alliance between a Targaryen pretender or a Targaryen-blooded figure and the Iron Islands, or at least someone brazenly claiming that heritage to gain support. Some lords from the Westerlands and the Reach, disenchanted with Baelish's taxes and cunning, might find that alliance appealing. Peter lost no time. He ordered the master of ships to quietly dispatch a squadron of war galleys to the waters off Stone Beacon, commanded by men he trusted. They would hide behind rocky outcrops or anchor out of sight, waiting for a signal to intervene. On land, a contingent of gold cloaks in plain garb would move to encircle the area. They were to take the conspirators alive if possible, or else kill them if they resisted. The watchers would send a raven the moment the meeting began in earnest. Peter would personally direct the final stroke. He wanted to crush this alliance before it could fully form, capture their so-called Salt King or Dragon, and parade him as a pretender or traitor. That would quell future rebellions for years. He decided to go to Stone Beacon in person, albeit with a small retinue. Appearances were crucial. If he marched there with an open army, the conspirators might scatter. Instead, he planned to slip in with a modest entourage, disguised as traveling lords on a progress to inspect the southwestern coasts. He would have enough loyal soldiers to strike when the time came, but not so many as to draw suspicion. Cunning was his hallmark, after all. Sansa, of course, would remain in King's Landing. He told her he was departing on business. She looked anxious, but did not protest. He left Ser Marwyn in charge of the city's day-to-day guard, instructing him to keep a vigilant eye on Varys. If the spider attempted any mischief in Peter's absence, it must be stopped. Peter had no illusions that Varys might not exploit his departure. But hopefully, the presence of loyal men and the knowledge that Peter could return swiftly would deter the eunuch from any bold action. Meanwhile, the small council would continue as normal, receiving instructions that Peter was simply away on official duties. Thus, in the pale dawn, Peter set out from the Red Keep with a column of some 50 men, well armed but wearing the livery of minor houses or no livery at all. Bronn rode among them, a half-smirk on his lips, ready for more excitement than the capital usually offered. They carried minimal banners, only one standard to denote the protector's presence, which would remain furled most of the journey. The roads were icy, muddy in patches. The group traveled slowly, bundling themselves in fur cloaks. Peter rode near the front, brooding on the events to come. He had not ventured far from King's Landing in some time. The open air and crisp winter wind felt both bracing and unsettling. He reminded himself that careful planning would ensure success. They passed through the riverlands, where fields lay barren and the rivers half-frozen. A few peasants paused to gawk, but Peter's men avoided making a scene. At each inn, they kept a low profile, paying with coin and moving on at first light. Rumors of the realm's caretaker traveling quietly spread, but no one was sure of his destination. Peter had sent out misleading tidings, suggesting he was touring a handful of coastal garrisons. If the conspirators heard of it, he hoped they would assume he was nowhere near Stone Beacon. Eventually, they reached the outskirts of the Reach, skirting large towns. Peter dispatched a small group of scouts ahead to confirm that the Tyrell men had not flooded the area. Reports came back that the Tyrell presence was minimal. Likely they had no idea the scale of the threat, or they hesitated to act without explicit orders. Perfect. Peter pressed on, weaving through minor roads until they approached the coastline. The air turned salty, the wind sharp off the sea. Clouds hung low, threatening a storm. A few fishing villages huddled along the shore. Locals eyed the newcomers warily but said nothing. Peter's watchers emerged from the shadows to report that the conspirators still congregated near Stone Beacon, presumably waiting for more allies or for a signal. Their numbers had grown to possibly 100 or more, including armed men. A small number of ships had anchored offshore, one of them displaying a ragged Kraken banner. The watchers could not confirm if Euron Greyjoy himself was present, or if someone else led them. There were also a few knights from the Westerlands, the Reach, perhaps even the Stormlands. They seemed to be waiting for the arrival of a king. Word was that the fabled figure would appear at the next new moon. That was mere days away. Peter's mouth tightened. The time was ripe. He told his watchers that when the new moon rose, the conspirators would gather in a ruined tower by the sea. Peter would strike then, capturing them all. He organized his men, scattering them in small groups near the coastline, hidden in farmsteads or wooded gullies. The war galleys from King's Landing had arrived as well, staying out of sight behind a rocky promontory. If the conspirators tried to flee by sea, they would find themselves trapped between the Crown's ships and the shoreline. It was a neat trap, reminiscent of the cunning moves Peter prided himself on. The fateful night approached. Peter took a small vantage on a low ridge overlooking the cove where the tower stood. The structure was an ancient ruin, battered by waves, crumbling at the top. Light glimmered from within, torches or lanterns. Perhaps 100 men milled about. Peter, watching through a spyglass, could make out the shapes of armed guards. A few battered tents had been erected, and a small bonfire burned near the tower's base. The moonless sky was pitch black, clouds swirling overhead, the sea crashing with intermittent gusts of wind. He glimpsed banners, some with partial shading that might depict a kraken. Others had unknown sigils or none at all. He saw men in ironborn garb, reeking of salt and tough leather. Among them were a handful of knights bearing gear more typical of the mainland. This was indeed a gathering of diverse conspirators. Peter's heart pounded. He never relished direct confrontation. He preferred bloodless manipulations, but sometimes a show of force was necessary to remind the realm that he was not to be trifled with. He whispered to Bronn, who crouched beside him, "Wait until I give the signal. Then your group will sweep in from the left. The rest will come from the right. The ships will cut off escape by sea." Bronn nodded, one hand resting on the hilt of his sword. "Just point me to whomever needs slitting." Peter withheld a sardonic comment. He would prefer prisoners, especially the ringleaders. With them in chains, he could unravel the entire conspiracy, expose which lords had supported it, and quell them thoroughly. Execution might be necessary eventually, but first he wanted confessions. He cast a glance at the black night sky. So this was how they wanted it. A midnight ritual, a crowning in darkness. He would show them who truly held the realm in his palm. A roar of wind blew across the cove, carrying the low thrum of drums. Drums? Peter saw flickers of torchlight swirl near the tower entrance. The conspirators were beginning some ceremony. A tall figure in ironborn garb raised a horn to his lips, blowing a deep note that rumbled along the shore like distant thunder. Shadows moved in the flickering light. Peter thought he saw a smaller figure bearing a chest or casket, perhaps containing something significant. Then, from the darkness, a voice boomed, carried by the wind. "Brothers of the Iron Sea, lords of Westeros, gather now. The hour is come." Peter's skin prickled. So theatrical. Another figure stepped forward, tall and lean. Unlike the first, he wore a robe that shimmered darkly, as if embroidered with scales. Peter's spyglass offered only a glimpse of the man's face, bearded, hair wild. He raised his arms as the others watched. We stand upon the brink of a new age. For too long the realm has bent to false caretakers and cunning serpents. Now we unite under the true blood, the Salt King, the dragon's heir. At that, a murmur rose among the assembled. A swirl of wind nearly extinguished their torches. Peter could not see the person they hailed as the rightful king. Was it Euron? Another Ironborn? A Targaryen-looking youth? He strained his spyglass, adjusting to the flickering light. A moment later, a shape emerged from the tower's gloom. This figure wore a cloak dyed a deep, brackish color, the edges embroidered with what might have been silver thread. The cloak billowed in the wind, obscuring the face. One of the men near him knelt and held forth a sword. No, it looked like a strange, twisted blade. Or was it a horn? Peter couldn't quite make it out. Before the robed man could continue, Peter hissed the command to his men. Subtlety was fine, but he wouldn't allow them time to complete some charismatic coronation. A cluster of archers hidden on the ridge notched arrows. Bronn raised a hand. Swords were drawn. The watchers along the perimeter began to move in, cutting off escape routes. Peter's plan was orchestrated. A swift strike, sowing confusion, capturing the leaders if possible. A volley of arrows whistled down from the ridge, striking near the bonfire. Several conspirators cried out, and the entire gathering erupted in panic. Shouts filled the air. "Attack! We're betrayed!" Men scrambled for weapons or ran for cover. The Ironborn bellowed curses, brandishing axes. The robed figure whirled, cloak flaring in the torchlight. Peter's men charged from both sides, swords gleaming. The watchers had the advantage of surprise, but the conspirators were numerous. Steel clashed on steel. The war galleys heaved into the cove, cutting off any boat that might try to push out to sea. Horns blared from the ships, echoing across the water. Peter stayed back on the ridge, directing the battle from safety. He watched as Bronn led a squad into the thick of the melee, cutting down an Ironborn reaver who lunged at them. Another group of crown men rushed the tower entrance, grappling with a knot of knights who fought with desperate vigor. Arrows rained sporadically, though the swirling wind spoiled some aim. All the while, Peter's pulse hammered. This was a risk, but he had planned carefully. He needed victory, and living prisoners to name the lords behind this. A savage cry rose from the tower's shadow. An Ironborn with a wicked curved blade crashed into Peter's men, felling two before a third ran him through. The robed man bellowed words lost in the wind, gesturing for some of his followers to retreat deeper into the ruin. Meanwhile, the figure in the brackish cloak tried to push toward the shore, flanked by a handful of guards. Peter saw them heading for a rowboat. If they reached it, they might slip past the rocks. He signaled to his archers. Arrows zipped through the air, striking two of the guards. The cloaked figure stumbled but did not fall. Bronn, seeing this, cursed and waded through the fray, heading to intercept. He reached the small group near the water's edge just as they prepared to shove off. Peter trained his spyglass on them, heart pounding. The robed figure and the cloaked figure stood side by side. The robed one lunged at Bronn with a dagger. Bronn deflected it, then smashed his pommel into the robed man's face. He collapsed into the surf. The cloaked figure tried to scramble into the boat, but Bronn seized the cloak from behind, yanking the figure back onto the shore. A scuffle ensued. The cloak slipped, revealing. Peter strained to see. Was it a man? A woman? A young face? He caught only a flash of pale features beneath the moonless sky. Then the figure broke free, leaping into the shallows, water sloshing around them. Bronn lunged, tackled the fleeing shape, and they both fell into the surf. Another arrow flew overhead. For a moment, they vanished beneath the waves. Then Bronn emerged, holding the limp figure by the hair, dragging them back onto the sand. Peter exhaled relief. Good. If that was their so-called king, they were about to be unmasked. The rest of the conspirators, disorganized by the ambush, were falling or fleeing. Some tried to break through the crown lines only to be cut down. Others threw down their arms, shouting for mercy. The robed man who had tried to lead the ritual lay unconscious, pinned by a guard. A few more Ironborn made a last stand near the tower base, but the Crown's numbers were too many. The fighting ended almost as swiftly as it began. Bodies littered the sand. The bonfire sputtered. The war galleys anchored close, shining lanterns on the grim scene. Peter spurred his horse forward, making his way down the slope toward the captured would-be king. He dismounted at the water's edge, stepping carefully over a corpse. Bronn stood nearby, panting, one arm bleeding from a shallow cut. At his feet knelt the cloaked figure, gagging on seawater. Guards had pinned the figure's arms behind them. The hood had fallen away, revealing a startlingly young face. Could not have been more than 20 summers. Pale skin, dark hair plastered to the forehead, eyes wide with furious defiance. Peter's eyebrows rose. A boy or a very young man? Beneath the wet cloak, glimpses of embroidery hinted at a crest that was half kraken, half dragon. So the conspirators had pinned their hopes on a child? The boy spat salt water, glaring at Peter. You have no right." Peter knelt, ignoring the sea-soaked hem of his fine cloak. "I have every right, my dear boy," he said softly. "I protect this realm from upstarts. Now, who might you be?" He reached out, lifting the boy's chin. The youth's eyes flashed with a mix of terror and defiance. Something in that face, the shape of it, the faint traces of Valyrian features, perhaps. Was he a bastard of House Targaryen? Or had the Ironborn plucked him from somewhere, weaving a false lineage? One of Peter's guards approached, dragging the robed man as well. That man's face was battered, but he managed to sneer. "You've doomed yourselves. The king's blood is real, fire and salt in his veins. We would have unleashed a new age." Bronn cuffed him. "Shut it." Peter gazed at the boy. "Your name," he repeated. "Unless you'd prefer we do this the hard way." The youth trembled. Then, with a voice cracking from cold and anger, he rasped, "My name is Aeron Velaryon of House Velaryon, rightful scion of the Targaryen line through the female side. The Ironborn have crowned me as the Salt Dragon King. You dare!" Peter nearly laughed aloud, though he only let out a quiet hiss of amusement. Velaryon. Indeed, that house had old ties to House Targaryen, but the line had long been overshadowed or thought extinct in its main branch. So this group had seized on a half-forgotten lineage, weaving a tale of dragon blood, plus the Ironborn's salt kingship. It was absurd, yet clearly some lords had pinned their hopes on it. "I see," Peter said, feigning mild interest. "You fancy yourself a king. And do you have a dragon, or just the old name?" The boy glared, swallowing. "We have allies in Essos, and a horn said to bind beasts of flame. We have the blessings of the drowned god. When the night is darkest, we will." Yes, I'm sure you have a fine story." Peter cut him off. He gestured to the guards. "Bind him along with the rest of the survivors. We will find out which lords put them up to this." He stood, gazing at the battered ruin of the conspirators' attempt. Dozens lay dead or moaning on the sand. A handful of crown men were injured, but not too many had fallen. All in all, it was a swift, decisive victory. The Watchers began searching the tower for documents or valuables. As the prisoners were dragged away, Peter felt a surge of triumph. Another pretender, extinguished before he could truly emerge. Another self-styled rightful heir, who would vanish into the dungeons of King's Landing. The handful of lords who had hoped to rally behind him would be unmasked and punished. Peter's reign as protector would continue unchallenged. The sea roared, and a cold wind whipped his cloak around him. Winter might be dark, but his hold on the realm's fate remained. He cast one last glance at the cowering boy who had claimed to be a Salt and Dragon King. The youth spat curses in some watery mixture of Valyrian and Ironborn dialect. Peter shook his head. Another misguided dreamer. For a moment he almost felt pity. Then he hardened himself. Pity was a weakness he could ill afford. He turned away, letting the waves crash behind him, confident he had averted disaster. But as he rowed back to the vantage point, a single nagging thought lingered. These men had truly believed they had a champion. They had gathered quietly, forging alliances across multiple regions. For everyone who had come here, how many more might be waiting elsewhere, or ready to shift their loyalty to the next candidate who claimed Targaryen or Baratheon or Stark blood? The Seven Kingdoms were always thirsty for legends, for a hero to break the cunning regent's stranglehold. As long as Petyr Baelish lived, these pretenders would arise. Yet he intended to ensure each one was snuffed out, one by one, until the lords finally realized that no hero would come to save them. It was nearing dawn by the time the crown forces secured the cove. Petyr stood on the ridge, watching the sky lighten to a sickly gray. The cold cut through his gloves, biting at his fingers. The sea battered the rocks. He inhaled the salt air, letting his mind travel forward. Another conspiracy ended, but the game continued. He would not falter, he would not yield. The realm was his, and no alliance of iron and dragon, or any other improbable union, would unseat him. When he returned to King's Landing with his captives, the city would surely buzz with the tale. The Protector had put down a dangerous rebellion, capturing a pretender who dared claim the throne. Petyr would spin it as a triumph of stability. He might even put the boy on display briefly, then lock him away or quietly dispose of him. The lords who had funded this enterprise would be rooted out and compelled to kneel. More pledges, more hostages, more leverage. The realm would remain firmly under Petyr Baelish's guiding hand. Snow began to fall again, flakes drifting onto the black sand below. Petyr closed his eyes briefly, then opened them, steadying himself. He swung onto his horse, gathering the reins. Time to lead the men back. Winter was dark and treacherous, but as ever, he would navigate it. In the hush of that bitter dawn, Petyr felt the old thrill that had guided him from obscurity to dominion. The knowledge that chaos was a ladder he had climbed and would climb again if need be. Let the conspiracies churn, let pretenders emerge. He was the realm's unassailable spider in the center of the web. So long as he drew breath, no rightful heir would wear a crown. Let them call him manipulative, cunning, or monstrous. He would live and he would rule, weaving the threads of fate until all of Westeros belonged to him in truth, and even beyond truth, in the hearts of men who bowed to him out of fear, habit, or the faint, fading hope that a Real king might yet come. He knew better. The only true ruler was the one who held power, and in Westeros that man was Petyr Baelish. As he guided his horse back toward the cove, flanked by Bronn and the rest, he glanced at the huddled prisoners once more. Their cause had died with the crash of waves and the swing of swords. The old tower by the sea was silent now, torches guttering out in the wind. No new dawn for them, only the same long winter under the realm's ever-watchful protector. And Petyr smiled thinly, for he knew that was as it should be.